I do not believe that aliens have visited the planet. What do you tell somebody who says this to you?
To me, and this is my bias, the evidence is overwhelming. And I noticed my shadow in front of me, and then the shadows were moving like that, suddenly they're coming close. And I realized there's what? And I looked up, and this object went right over the top of the trees.
Can you give a sort of generic account?
No. That's why it's called TS.
Top secret. So other things that you can't talk about?
I just can't talk about it. No. That's what allows someone like Neil deGrasse Tyson to come in and say, well, it's not possible for them to get from there to here. Well, that's ridiculous. I mean, even he knows that. If it is easy enough just to skip dimensions and move from one parallel world to another, if the timelines are misaligned or disaligned or not aligned, then that means that something which is 1 trillion years old could skip back to us, which we're only 14 billion years old. XYZ at the White House is really pissed at you, and you should not ever say anything like that again because Title 18 applies. I said, what does that mean? Lethal force is operable.
You've started numerous multi-million-dollar companies. You have risen to the top of academia with an endowed chair here at Stanford Medical School. You've made research breakthroughs in cancer and immunotherapy that have helped save many, many lives. And yet you also research a topic that is essentially forbidden by academia, and that's aliens. Before we get into how a top scientist researches this question, which is really what I want to do in this interview, I'd like to get an idea of how Garry Nolan, the man, first became interested in aliens.
Well, I can actually trace it as far back as I think the first time I opened a National Geographic, I was about 8 years old. And there was a star map there, a fold-out star map of the old National Geographics. And it was basically a depiction of the current understanding of the universe and where our galaxy was relative to the few others that we could see at the time and where we sat in the Milky Way. And it was a picture which, you realize when looking at it, you're spanning, hundreds of millions of light years. And I just remember thinking at that moment, what kinds of civilizations or stories or histories might have risen and fallen across that expanse over the time frame that it covered, which was billions and billions of years. And it just stuck with me as a thought. And about then, the time that I was able to read better books and novels, I actually was completely uninterested in traditional fiction. I gravitated to science fiction. And the science fiction that I found the most interesting was a depiction of alien cultures. And especially people like Larry Niven, David Brin, and others who started from let's say, an evolutionary standpoint of what assumptions would a culture have about its philosophy of life based on where it evolutionarily came from. Larry Niven being one of the best, where he says, okay, if you had a culture of intelligent herd animals, how would they be different than a culture of obligate carnivores? And what would be the philosophical stances of those? I just found that fascinating to think about. And I always liked as well what is currently today called space opera, which is the large views of a universe which is so big that humanity gets lost in it.
It's interesting that already from the beginning, science was a huge part of your interest in extraterrestrials. I mean, you mentioned evolution and this map of space. And that brings me to the next thing I just wanted to ask at the outset. it is not immediately obvious why somebody who specializes in immunotherapy, cancer research, would get tapped to investigate potentially extraterrestrial phenomena. So where was the connection between these two aspects of your research?
Well, one, I remember just sort of when I had discovered YouTube, and you click around and you find a YouTube about aliens. And I remember clicking around on them and going, that's interesting. These are interesting stories. This is interesting. And I came across a claim that somebody had about a mummy that had been found, a small mummy, only about that big, that they claimed was an extraterrestrial. And I thought, well, it's a body and it looks relatively well preserved. I could prove or disprove what that is. And so I contacted the people who represented the owner. I got a small piece of it delivered to me.
This is the Atacama Mummy?
The Atacama Mummy, right. And, over the next few years, because I did it on my own, out of my own pocket, I showed, in fact, that it wasn't alien at all. It was a human with mutations that could have explained what it looked like. And I had probably 13 or 14 other co-investigators on the paper, including a whole division of Roche Diagnostics, to whom I had actually sold one of my companies for genomics analysis. And then I had 3 other Stanford professors on the paper. And so, it was, the idea behind that was, okay, here's an extraordinary claim. Let's just do regular science. You don't need extraordinary evidence. And so that got me started. I actually earned from that the ire of the UFO community, because they said, oh, here's another debunker coming in. And I said, no, and actually papers, it was worldwide. The paper went worldwide. What better clickbait than Stanford professor sequences alien baby?
Yeah.
But it wasn't to me about debunking. It was just about doing the science of it. And so, because I was doing this work and I had been in a movie about it even prior to the publication, I came, I guess, to the attention of people in the government who had at the time been investigating a number of pilots and intelligence community individuals who'd been harmed through some extraordinary means. I mean, they were claiming to have rashes on their body, and most of these people were either in the diplomatic corps or the intelligence corps, or a few pilots, and some of them, a very small subset of them, had claimed interactions with UFOs. But these had all had sort of filtered up the chain of command and over to what was called at the time the weird bucket. It's like, we don't know what to do with these things, but once enough of them had been collected, it became an object of interest, because it was like, okay, well, now we're starting to see a pattern. And so they were doing medical workups and psychological evaluations of all of these people, and which I had nothing to do with. But as part of it, they wanted blood tests done. And so, as you mentioned in the intro, I've developed a number of instruments that are used worldwide for everything from blood analysis to biopsy to intracellular analysis to gene delivery, et cetera. And they showed up at my office literally unannounced and said, hey, can you help us on this? And they began showing me data. And they didn't mention right away that any of these individuals were, had seen craft, or had been claimed to be harmed by craft. And so, over the first, let's say 15, 20 minutes, I was looking over the data that they had. They brought MRI output, et cetera. And I was saying, well, this is really interesting. And then I started going down the list of the things that they had. And I said, wait, what is this about UFOs? And that was when I actually thought it was a joke at the beginning. And they were deadly serious about it. And so I gave them advice. And it turned out that the majority of the people that we actually had looked at was about 6 or 7 years before it was known as Havana syndrome. We actually called it at the time, by the time we sort of worked out some of the medical diagnostics, we were calling it interference syndrome because these people were being interfered with. And once it was obvious that it was now something that was involved with the diplomatic corps, et cetera, that cohort of 100, of about 80 and 90 of them ended up, being shunted over to the U.S. government, where they were now classified under what is today called anomalous health incidents. And it's a serious thing. You can go find it on the military websites, the government military websites, as to how it is that it should be dealt with, and who in the government you need to contact, et cetera. But once you had taken those 85 or so people off the list, what remained were, let's say 10 or so individuals who'd claimed interaction with UFOs. And so, those were the more extraordinary ones to me. And I was like, okay, well, I want to interview some of these people. I want to go talk to these people because I wanted to know that I wasn't being fooled. And so I was flown out to meet some of these individuals. That, as far as I could tell, they were telling me the truth. I'm not a lie detector test, but I'm a pretty good judge of character. And when you suddenly have, half a dozen or so people that you've met who tell these stories, and these are not like, it's not like a high school kid on a bender, after the prom. These are serious men and women who had, who we trust with the defense of the United States, who had a story to tell. And what upset me the first about it was that, not that it had happened to them, but that they were being ignored by their medical superiors or their superiors and laughed at. And the damage was obvious. I mean, the damage was incontrovertible, right? I mean, there it is on an MRI. People say, oh, well, these are all anecdotes, these are stories. Yeah, but you have scarring inside of their body. Scarring inside the body doesn't happen, randomly. You have scarring inside of the brain that looked like white matter disease. And so, I don't know, it just raised my personal ire about it, and, the righteous indignation that, first of all, they're being ignored, and second, that one of the options of what actually might have happened was being ignored. That, yes, it is an extraordinary option that these individuals came in contact with a UFO. Absolutely extraordinary, and probably the least likely of 1,000 different alternative explanations. And yet, most of the other alternative explanations could be dismissed with, and the psychological aspect was off the table because these people had gone through batteries of tests. And so what was left was, something interacted with these, and UFOs or aliens or interdimensionals or you name it, people call them ultraterrestrials or something. It was still on the table, and this is where I actually have a lot of disagreement with my colleagues, where they say, well, everybody says that you claim and you believe in aliens. I don't believe in anything. I believe in the data. I believe that if it's still an option, it stays on the table. I mean, that's how I became such a good scientist, by seeing data that was sitting off the curve and not letting the students or the postdocs ignore it and say, explain that dot that is way off the curve. It's either a mistake or it's something interesting. And so let's go look at it. And that's always where discovery lies.
That was a great answer, and there are so many things there that I'd like to touch on in detail. So I'd really love to get back to these anomalous health events, for instance. But one thing that I want to hone in on first at the outset of our conversation is what makes good science and the methodology that you follow in answering or dealing with these questions. And first, I think that will bring us back to the Atacama Mummy, which is in a certain sense not that interesting because, as you said, you don't believe it is of extraterrestrial origin. But there are interesting things there. So the first thing that I just want to ask about it is, one, why did people think it might have been of extraterrestrial origin? And then was your attitude in dealing with this hypothesis that you wanted to confirm it or that you wanted to disconfirm it?
So it was neither. It was just, I can tell you what it is. I mean, the reason why people thought that it might be was because of the shape of the skull and the fully formed apparent bone structure. So the first thing I did when I got the X-rays of the young girl, now that we know it was a young girl, probably premature birth, was that I checked with some people in the Department of Radiology and pediatric radiology. I happen to know the chairman of that group, and I said, "Hey, who can I talk to about this?" And I said, "Well, it turns out that we have the world's expert now working with us, who literally wrote the book on pediatric bone disorders and the genetics of pediatric bone disorders. And he's on the paper. And was a professor here. And I took the X-rays to him, and he said, "Well, this is unusual. I have not seen this group of morphologies before, all in one. It could be explained by X, Y, or Z." But he didn't laugh me out of the room. He said it might be interesting. So I said, "Okay, let's do it." So I arranged then to get a piece of the rib from Barcelona, where the specimen resided, and proceeded to do the genetics. And then, and this is to your point of how do you do good science. So I started to get results that I didn't understand. And when you're doing old DNA, or DNA that is, not fresh, you often get little chunks of it. And so what you're trying to do when you do a sequencing is you take all these little chunks and you try to line them all up by doing what's called an overread. You do more reads of the genome, like 28 or 30 in this case, overreads, so that you could line it all up. And there were more mutations than there should have been. So I said, okay, well, who do I need to talk to get the skinny on how it is that I should correct for this? And so it turns out that there are procedures to correct some of the sequences, the reads of the sequences that you get. So a lot of the stuff that I initially thought was unknown, that excited everybody, in the first movie about it, were actually explainable by bringing in the experts. It's in science, knowing the limit of your knowledge and your capability is how you do good science. It's knowing that I don't know this, I need to go ask somebody else. And so all the experts in either bone morphology or how to fix it in terms of the sequence reads, or in the case of where the specimen came from, it was from the Atacama region of Chile. We had, in the Department of Genetics, the world's expert in Southern American indigenous peoples and the DNA of them. And so he had the databases that allowed us to compare what were called allele frequencies of the DNA and show that it precisely accorded with the Atacama region of indigenous peoples. So, again, I'm not an expert in that. I never would have been able to even find those databases at the time, but we had one just literally down the hall from me. And so that's how you do it. And then we brought all those people together. We had my students, we had people from Roche, we had the students of some of the other people who all collected the data. And then they wrote most of the paper, the students, and I then cleaned it up and made it polished for submission to a journal. And so at the end of the day, the onus of being right or wrong rests on me and not on the students whatsoever. And then went out there and published it and became a huge, click fest. I got phone calls from just about every major newspaper on the planet about it. And then the next week, actually, then a storm hit, because the Chilean archaeology community felt that I had at the time disrespected the grave of somebody that they said that this was stolen from a church. Well, I didn't know anything about that, and yet in Chile there had been a movie about the specimen, and not saying anything about this in Spanish. So even if I had known Spanish, it still would have been that. So it was like, and then they attacked me on that, and I was just like, well, you had 20 years to do something about it. I did something about it. So I think, and I have shown what it is, and now we can put this to rest. And I basically, even at the time of the first news reports, I said, now that we know this is a young girl, this should be returned to Chile, and it should be given proper burial rights. It shouldn't be a circus act. And so one of the people who had been involved with, let's say, PRing this, was very upset with me, and claimed that I had committed fraud, that I was being paid off by the CIA to lie. And so, those are all pretty slanderous statements, but I think if you're willing to get out there and just do good science, you don't need to go and get all legal about it. And so, literally to this day, yesterday I was on Twitter and somebody was saying, Nolan's a liar, because he did this about the Atacama. That's social media today. But to me, it again was about just showing what the data is, being very careful with your conclusions. And the paper that we wrote was filled with caveats about what we felt the genes were about. And that's how a good paper is done. You just make sure that you caveat the heck out of it, and don't come to the kinds of conclusions, unfortunately, that the media does. So the media will take any normal science paper and will turn it into something hyperbolic, too often, unfortunately. And so then the scientist gets painted with the conclusion that somebody in the media, news title room came up with, and then you're defending that. So one of the things I learned from all of this is, don't let the media define what it is that you say. Politicians will tell you probably the same thing, that don't let the media define the narrative. Make sure you continually correct it.
Well, one of the reasons I wanted to start off by talking about this is it's ironic to me that the UFO community would have been upset with you at first for this and labeled you a debunker, because what they should want on their side is an extremely reputable, intelligent scientist who examines the data very thoroughly and clear-mindedly and does not make pronouncements about UFOs unless they are thoroughly vetted and he really believes in them. Because otherwise you become the boy who cries wolf. And now our listeners and viewers will have seen how thoroughly you investigated this claim before rejecting it, so that when later in this interview, as I suspect you might do, when you do make claims about UFOs, they will understand that you have only made these claims after thinking about them and researching them very, very carefully.
Yeah. And actually, to be honest, I'll make very few claims about UFOs per se, apart from the fact that I've seen one up close when I was a paper boy, but that's an anecdote. But it's what was important at the time, and after the CIA got me involved, and then they introduced me to other scientists who were working literally with the government on this matter, and have now come out and said, and it'll be actually in a movie called Age of Disclosure coming out shortly, has said, we worked on the reverse engineering program. We worked on alien craft. I mean, those are claims, right? But I know these people. I've worked with them now for 10 years. I've worked with and spoken to probably at least half a dozen people who've worked on what's called the program or the legacy program. And so, have I seen an alien body? No. Have I seen a craft on the ground? No. But if I use the same kind of science insight that I do when I'm talking with another scientist about some subject matter that we're both, competent around, and I look at their body language and I then put it together with a dozen or several hundred other things that I've heard from other people, the story all meshes together. So, but the objective, though, has to be, from a scientific standpoint, that all of those are, at the end of the day, just anecdotes and stories. And so I can't hand, as of yet, to a colleague of mine, the definitive proof. I can show them a library full of evidence, all of which points to that there's something here. Evidence is not proof. Data is not evidence. Evidence is contextualized data. Proof actually only really happens in math. And so, the important thing I think for your audience to understand, if they're not a scientist or an engineer, is that a scientist is meant to be wrong every day. What you put out is part of the story of a search for truth. And so what I say today will be recontextualized tomorrow when I collect more data, or when the data that I look at causes me to ask the question, what does this mean? Oh, wait a second, maybe I need to do this experiment because this is how I will rewrite the view of what I think reality is. And we've seen that in physics over the decades. Everything from Newton through Maxwell's equations, through Einstein, and then quantum mechanics, and then more recently string theory, or a half a dozen other theories about how reality is put together. And we still don't know what the answer is. But tomorrow, or next week, or next year, there'll be a new theory that maybe gives a better picture of what is. So I think the audience needs to understand that the objective of a scientist is to be wrong today, but righter tomorrow.
No, very interesting. It's also interesting that you mentioned string theory, because string theory, quite famously, I mean, it's been a huge topic of discussion and investigation, especially over the last 30 years or so, and no experiment has ever come close to finding a string.
Right.
And yet it's the fundamental paradigm, or the foundational paradigm in high energy particle physics right now. And it sounds like you're of the opinion that we have some, even if we don't have the smoking gun, the laser gun on the table between us, you think that there is very, very strong evidence that is mutually compatible and that points to this hypothesis.
To me,
thesis.
And this is my bias, the evidence is overwhelming. Overwhelming. And yet, again, I need to do an experiment, which I'm in the process of doing with others, extremely well funded. It's called the Skywatcher project, and people can go look it up, where we have individuals who have claimed to have been on the crash retrieval programs. And we have ways, we feel, of getting the craft to show up in restricted airspaces, where we know that they will not be oversights of planes, or we know they're not satellites, et cetera. Those are all pretty easy to rule out. And hopefully we'll get either better pictures, or maybe we'll get somebody to land and walk over and shake our hand. But that's the objective, is to get the kind of scientific evidence that everybody claims doesn't exist. And so it has to be done right.
So I will call this dessert, talking about the actual evidence that we have. But I'd like to now move back a little bit and set up some foundations for our discussion going forward. The first thing that I think is important, for me at least, that we discuss is some terminology, because we've used a number of different words already: extraterrestrials, UFOs, UAPs, aliens, a couple I didn't know, interdimensionals and ultradimensionals,
Ultraterrestrial.
ultraterrestrials. And so what I would like to do first is just get a handle on what a UAP is, because I have the sense that that is the current term of art to describe these phenomena.
So the term is a redefinition of UFO, which is unidentified flying object. But what happens if the object's not flying? What happens if it's underwater? So, you know, you would call that maybe a USO, unidentified submerged object. But what happens if it's in space? It's not flying in space. There's no flying in space. It's space. There's no air to fly through. So it was, and this is in the best scientific tradition, is create a term that generifies what it is that you're talking about with a definition that can cover as many of the things without saying anything about what you think it is. We know it's unidentified. It's anomalous, meaning it's doing something we don't know what it is, what and how it's doing it, and it's an object. End of story. You know, or in this case, phenomena, because maybe it's not an object. Maybe it's a ball of plasma. Is a ball of plasma an object? I don't know. Talk to a physicist. But you know, we think of objects as being solid. So that's sort of been that has been the redefinition of UFOs to UAP. Do you want me to go into the others?
First, these anomalous health events that you discussed earlier, if there's, for instance, damage in somebody's brain and we don't know where it came from, but we might have reason to believe that they were in the vicinity of a UAP, would that brain damage itself be a UAP, or would there be a...
No.
Okay.
No. That's an anomalous health incident. And again, the reason for calling it a generic term like anomalous health incident rather than Havana syndrome is Havana syndrome is meant to signify specifically what was happening apparently at the Cuban American embassy in Cuba. And so, no, it's not. I mean, UAP are meant to be some sighted object or effect which seems to affect the local environment in a way that we can't explain.
Okay. And then the other terms that I mentioned, I would love to hear about them, but only the ones that you think might be relevant to this conversation, so the ones that are still used. So if ultraterrestrial or interdimensional are used, I'd love to hear about them.
So yeah, okay, conjure in your mind what the word alien means.
Ridley Scott.
Ridley Scott, right? Hollywood. Almost always in, you know, the movies, the aliens are here to pillage our planet, or, you know, are going to eat us. And so that's unfortunate, for one. But alien also implies from another planet. And so the moment you say that, you limit the possibilities of what it might be. And so that's what allows someone like Neil deGrasse Tyson to come in and say, well, it's not possible for them to get from there to here. Well, that's ridiculous. I mean, even he knows that. You know, the universe is 14 billion years old. Even with a conventional rocket, I could get from one side of the galaxy to the other in a mere 500 million years, right? But you could do that step by step. You could create something, what's called a von Neumann probe, which you send out one of them, it lands on a planet, it makes 100 copies of itself, and it sends those out. And just with conventional rocketry, you could skip your way across the galaxy and get from any place to the other. Now, you're not the same person that got off the ship on the far end as who got on or launched it in the first place. But that doesn't matter. You can do it. And so to say that they can't get here presumes that you're taking a bus ride or something. And so it's just, on the face of it, a ludicrous statement. But it still, though, limits what the possibilities are, because you've probably heard of the multidimensional hypothesis that if you look at quantum physics, one interpretation is the many worlds hypothesis. that you could have a situation where reality is not just the 3D space within which we operate, but it could be laced or overlaid with hundreds or millions or an infinite number of additional universes, all of which are simultaneously operating. We can't see them. We can't get there, but maybe somebody else has figured out how to.
I've done a number of episodes about the many worlds or Everettian interpretation of quantum mechanics. And one important feature of these parallel universes is that they're not causally connected, at least according to modern quantum physics. So is the idea that, sure, that may be our current Everettian theory of quantum mechanics, but as you said, science never proves anything, only math proves things from axioms. It is at least conceivable that some more advanced society has an improved or different theory of quantum mechanics that says, oh, these.
Here's how to do it.
Okay.
Here's, so there are these, imagine a civilization, imagine us, we don't walk off a cliff in the next 100 years. Imagine us a million years from now. What will we be capable of doing? What would any civilization be capable of doing? We don't know. But so one of the things that needs to be on the table is that you need to say these might be interdimensional. It's easy to say. It doesn't prove it. What it does do though is it opens the aperture a little bit in terms of, well, if it is easy enough just to skip dimensions and move from one parallel world to another, then if the timelines are misaligned or disaligned or not aligned, then that means that something which is 1 trillion years old could skip back to us, which we're only 14 billion years old. So there's that. Then there's the ultraterrestrial, which posits that a civilization might have arisen millions of years ago, hundreds of millions of years ago. Maybe some small sect of dinosaurs achieved a level of competency, and then they decided to go underground, and they, created a civilization there. And they said, well, it's better to be underground than above ground for whatever number of reasons. So maybe they're what it is that we see. Which is interesting because the things that people claim that they see actually have no ears and no noses, and reptiles don't have ears or noses.
That is interesting.
It's interesting.
That's something that's.
It's not anything that anybody claims. I'm just making the observation. So ultra-terrestrial could also be somebody who arrived here through the von Neumann probe approach, tens of millions of years ago, set up shop, again decided let's just go under the ocean, or let's go underground and build our stuff down there. Maybe they're afraid of other things that might be out there, so they don't want to advertise where they are. That's the dark universe idea of many people, that you don't want to advertise that you're here, because maybe you make yourself a target. And we've been broadcasting to anybody who has a telescope receiver that we're here. So maybe that's the reason. So those are both classified generally under ultra-terrestrial. Again, just an idea.
So I don't want the interdimensional question to be a sticking point or anything, but I do think it's interesting for a number of reasons. So quantum mechanics, or the standard model of particle physics, is our best confirmed physical theory to this point. It's confirmed to something like 14 decimal places. And what question this raises for me is, how are we supposed to assign a probability to something like the possibility that it's totally wrong and there might be travel between these disconnected dimensions, or that these anomalous phenomena can be attributed to the results of a von Neumann probe that landed 10 million years ago? How do you assign probabilities to these what ifs, and whether or not we should investigate?
Well, you have to keep them all on the table, but maybe you hope that one day, if you meet any of them, they'll tell you what it is that they are. And I mean, I'm frankly less interested in what they are than what they do, or what we think that we can see them doing. And one more thing to add to all of these things is the other one called the time traveling hypothesis, that there's some future us who figured out how to time travel and come back and watch their beginnings. It would be like us going back and 20 million years ago and looking at our most distant
I haven't heard
ancestors.
this one. That's interesting.
Yeah. So and that one's been around for a while. But there's a professor, Mike McMaster, who wrote a book about it, and pretty interesting. And he kind of fleshes the whole thing out. And again, it's just one of many ideas.
It's a fascinating idea too. In preparation for this interview, before you sent me some of the titles that you thought I ought to read, I read Van Daniken's Chariots of the Gods, and that kind of makes sense in the context of this hypothesis, in that we are so very much interested in what happened in ancient Greece and all these ancient cultures. That's why we have archaeologists working on them right now. So it is interesting to think that, oh yeah, maybe in the future we would go back to try to study these.
Or somebody else might come here and look at us and say, okay, well, let's study this primitive society. But I think one of the things you have to add into your whole evidence cache is, okay, well, where do these things seem to show up? And beyond, somebody seeing it, on a farm or, when they're in the car, they show up apparently a lot around nuclear sites. Some of the most famous incidents, of course, are around our nuclear aircraft carriers. There are these famous incidents about them showing up over nuclear missile silos where they shut them all down in the US, and they just say, look at what we can do. We're going to shut all your stuff down. Or they show up in the former Soviet Union and they turn the missiles on and start the countdown. And there's a very famous story there around that. So when you see these kinds of things, maybe the answer is, and this is what I call the angry monkey hypothesis, is that maybe they're showing up and because they're now worried what the angry monkeys can do. Because now the angry monkeys can make nuclear weapons. And despite how powerful and futuristic they might be, they still can't stop a nuclear bomb, right, from hurting them. So maybe if we are about to flower out into the local galactic arm sometime in the next 1,000 or 10,000 years, just again by conventional means, maybe the neighbors want to know what the angry monkeys are up to.
Very interesting. Okay, I'm glad though that we took the time to discuss some of this terminology. You already brought up there is this abundance of evidence, and we will get to that later, but I still want to set the specific evidence aside and talk about our prior probabilities for believing that aliens or any of these other numbers of possible entities could have come to Earth. So in the beginning of our conversation, you mentioned as a child being struck by this map, I think, of the galaxy in National Geographic, and you're wondering what sorts of cultures might have bloomed across space and time. You also mentioned an entity with our rockets could travel across the galaxy in 500 million years. So the question is, before looking at any of the specific evidence that we might have, how likely should we think it is that over the course of the last 4 billion years, or even now, extraterrestrials would have come to Earth?
So, I mean, that's actually the question that I pose to people is, the question is not, are they here, but can they be here? And the answer is yes, they can be here. And so you just have to look at NASA and what all of the exoplanet analysis is showing is that the conditions for life exist everywhere. I mean, absolutely everywhere. Doesn't mean they look like us. It just means that the raw material to create life is not unique to this planet. And so, one of the actual ideas is that we didn't come here, we didn't get here, or we're not here because we happened here, But there's this idea of that life has been traveling across the galaxy. The
Panspermia?
panspermia, yes, exactly. And people go, oh, that's crazy. Well, they just resurrected a worm that was 30,000 years old from the ice.
Did they really?
Yeah, yeah, they just did. And they just showed recently that actually the substrata miles down in the Earth is filled with life.
Miles down.
Miles down.
Bacteria?
That divide every 10,000 years.
Oh, wow.
Okay, that they're basically frozen in time, and that they are so slow growing, and yet that's their mode of action. So,
And we already know that there are creatures like tardigrades that can
Yeah.
survive essentially any environment.
So imagine you're a planet that has life on it, and another planet comes whizzing by, cracks you open, huge chunks of you go, splatter across the local galactic arm, and you eventually end up circling another sun, and you eventually, like an asteroid, end up hitting a planet that is, fertile possibility for life. So that's the panspermia. People say, oh, come on, you can't have it. Well, every piece of metal that you're wearing right now came from an exploded nova from several billion years ago that became a gas, coalesced into another sun, and created a planetary disk, or a pre-planetary disk, that then condensed into planets. So it took several billion years to make the metal that you're wearing today. So why can't it be that life could move from one place to another, and so that life is everywhere? So, the point is that it only took, once life established on Earth, the Earth's 4 billion years old, I don't know, life was a couple of billion years or so old. It only took 2 billion years for us to arise eventually out of the non-sentient animal life. Why couldn't it happen elsewhere if there's a billion other planets out there that have life? So I just don't get the pushback. The answer is there's not evidence yet of it. There's evidence that it could happen because the seeds of the opportunity are there. But we're waiting for something to arrive that shows that, let's say there was life on Mars, right? That if there was life on Mars, or there's life on one of the moons of Jupiter, which have the oceans, the ice oceans, but clearly liquid water underneath. I think the chance of us knowing that life can be other than on Earth is probably only a few decades away. Maybe Elon will take one of his Teslas to Mars and go look, or maybe we'll find something on Ganymede or one of the other planets.
That seems to answer the question whether or not it's possible that something like a bacterium could arrive on Earth. But how do you think about the question of whether or not something intelligent could come to Earth?
Well, I said it. That's the von Neumann probe. There's ways that we can go near the speed of light using something called a ram scoop, where you have an electromagnetic net that's strong enough that it can collect the local hydrogen and push it through a ramjet, which humans have ramjets. I mean, a lot of our cruise missiles and things are basically ramjets. I'll probably get yelled at by engineers that'll correct me on that, but essentially the idea is that you suck the hydrogen in one side by collecting it electromagnetically across many miles of interstellar space, and then that gets pushed into an engine and fired out the back, a fusion engine, let's say, if you had a fusion engine. And so, you could get up to many times conventional human speed and get to where you're going. Now, there's all kinds of things that could get in the way. If a small pebble hit you at 100,000 miles an hour, or even, some fraction of light speed, that would be the end of you. So you have to have defenses against that, you could imagine. But again, you can imagine electromagnetic defense that shunts things aside or that can see things ahead and shoots a laser at them and blows them up before they hit you, et cetera. And that's not even imagining what it is that some of the claimed movements of these objects would say must be possible. I mean, we've all heard and seen of they go from 0 to 5,000 miles an hour instantly, or they take right turns at 5,000 miles an hour. You'd be mush on the windscreen if you did anything close to that, even at 100 miles an hour. So clearly, they've got a way of manipulating inertia and mass, or ignoring inertia and mass. And one of the ways that it could be done was actually came up with by a standard physicist by the name of Alcubierre, Mexican physicist, who came up with the idea that you could bend space and warp space, just like Star Trek, with the use of negative mass and negative energy, or negative energy. And you basically warp space, you put yourself in your own bubble, and you don't move. You just basically slant your local universe in a way that allows you to move. But so you aren't breaking any laws. The bubble moves as fast as can be. The problem is with that is that the amount of energy required to accomplish it is like the whole rest mass of the sun every second. So at least his original equations. People come up with other equations that bring it down by orders of magnitude. But the other problem is nobody has negative mass or negative energy. Nobody knows how to produce negative energy. But then there's other physicists. Once they see those equations and they say, oh, well, here's a trick that maybe we could do so that we can just use regular mass. And well, where's the energy coming from? No matter what, it's more than the whole planet can output. And so you have to basically come up with some way of using, some people claim that they're using the zero-point field. So have some way to access the zero-point energy field, which is all around us. But it's so locked up in space-time that you can't access it. It's sort of the rest energy of the universe. But particles appear and disappear down at that level, at the Planck level. And so somebody's saying, oh, somebody has a way to kind of rip it open and pull out the infinite energy that's sitting in the universe. Okay, it's an idea. But it, to me, is exciting because if somebody knows how to do anything approaching what it is that we see them doing, that to me is just an exciting opportunity to advance human knowledge. And so why, even if it's crazy, shouldn't anybody who has an interest in it be allowed to explore the opportunity? Because the value of the outcome is so enormous that it makes the risk worthwhile. And, that's basically venture capital.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And it's how we make huge breakthroughs, paradigm-breaking breakthroughs in fields like physics. Some new interloper in the field working outside of the paradigm of normal science makes some breakthrough with anomalous phenomena that the current researchers have been unable to figure out.
Very often, ignorance is the engine of creativity. We often think that creativity requires some kind of forethought. Sometimes it's just, I don't know what the rules are, so therefore I'm going to try this. And oh wow, it worked. And I mean, I can't even tell you the number of times that I have been told by, at the time then, senior scientist, I'm a senior scientist myself now, that what I wanted to do or thought could be done was impossible. You can't do that. You can't make retroviruses in a couple of days. It takes 3 months. I showed it could be done in 3 days, and now every gene therapy that's done in the world with retroviruses or lentiviruses uses my basic process. Every CRISPR library screen that's done, that people hear about CRISPR all the time, if it's done in a mammalian cell and it's done using retroviruses, it was done using a technology I developed here at Stanford over 25 years ago. And it's still actually one of my best grossing licenses, throws a significant amount of money at me every year.
This might seem a bit tangential, but your background, you're not an MD, correct?
Correct. Yeah.
So is your background, you're an expert biologist, or what is the very granular field in which you were trained and you're an expert in?
I got my PhD here in the Department of Genetics, but I trained as an immunologist in the Department of Genetics with Len and Lee Herzenberg, a husband-wife team, who had invented something called the flow cytometer, or the FACS, fluorescence activated cell sorter, and had also, with one of their postdocs, who had been also my mentor when I was there, they had invented the monoclonal antibody, humanized antibodies that were used and are used in nearly every immunotherapy in the world today. Those, and then Stan Cohen, who was chairman of the department when I went there, was part of the Cohen-Boyer patents. Those 3 patents in the Department of Genetics were blockbusters and the biggest at Stanford, frankly, the biggest in the world. And so I lived in an environment of that kind of take basic research and turn it into something translational, hand it to industry, and then get back to the lab, right? Don't rest on your laurels.
This background is perfect, essentially, for what I want to ask, because as an expert in genetics, you're an expert in the fundamental building block of all life on Earth. Earlier, you mentioned that when we look around, we find all of these planets that appear to be habitable. That's what the exoplanet research has told us. But one of the biggest and, to my mind, least sensible constraints on xenobiology, the unspoken assumption is, yeah, these planets are all apparently habitable, but for creatures like us, when we should be considering all sorts of other alternatives. Does life need to be carbon-based? Does it need water? Does it need to live in the quote-unquote Goldilocks zone? Does it need to be DNA-based? Right. So the question that I would ask you then, because I think that this would significantly raise our prior probability for there being life elsewhere in the galaxy, universe, let alone the galaxy, is should we expect that life needs to be carbon-based or require water, or how do you think about this?
Well, I think from a Bayesian prior, the answer is the probability is 1 that it can happen with carbon, right? So we know it can happen with carbon and oxygen. And actually, this is interesting. Something I was thinking about the other day. The majority of our body is made up of carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, hydrogen. Maybe a couple of other low mass elements. What does that mean? Those were amongst the first elements that were created at the instantiation of the universe. So the fundamental...
Before you go on, for our listeners, that's because a lot of the heavier elements were created in supernova.
In supernova. They needed the compaction of the supernova, the fusion events that were occurring. So the essential material required to create life existed probably only a few, maybe a billion years. I don't even know what the numbers are, but very soon after the universe cooled sufficiently. So that's the first part. But something else happened at the start of the universe. As the universe was instantly expanding, there was an opportunity for plasma and energy to have nearly every organizational structure possible. So take the entire mass of everything in the universe and now compact it down to the size of the galaxy as it's expanding. And what you get are organizational energies that could have just by chance been life. And if any of them had the ability to make more copies of themselves with that, and that actually is a hypothesis of a famous physicist, Boltzmann. So these are called Boltzmann brains. So his idea was that there was organizational plasmas and energies that just by chance, because you had every possible organization that could have been of those energies, and you could have actually created consciousness or something that acted like life
Yeah.
as far back as when the universe first started.
Yeah, no, Boltzmann brains are quite fascinating. The idea that based on these random thermodynamic fluctuations, if the universe is infinite, then we should much more likely than not actually be Boltzmann brains. Because there would be a nearly infinite amount of them, but
Right.
only ostensibly a significantly smaller number of real flesh, blood,
Right.
and bone brains. And that's a novel form of extraterrestrial
Right.
that I had not considered.
Yeah. So it's a hypothesis. It's a brain experiment, if you will. But it's, you look at it and you go, huh, well, yeah, maybe consciousness has been around longer than even planets were or suns.
One thing that's really fascinating about this idea is that undoubtedly Boltzmann brains should be considered extraterrestrials.
Yeah.
And while I mentioned at the outset of this interview, and you would agree with me, of course, I think, so maybe I shouldn't say of course, but that most of academia poo-poos the idea of extraterrestrials, Boltzmann brains remain a serious thorn in the side of physicists.
Yeah.
Because our theories point to their existence, but it results in this very problematic sort of paradoxical thinking, because we have to assume then that it's much more likely than not that we are aliens,
Right.
that we are Boltzmann brains.
Right.
So that's funny.
I mean, when people poo-poo it or whatever, I frankly just start ignoring them. I consider it, again, it's the difference between evidence and proof. It's as long as it's still on the table, we should have the conversation. We can assign a probability if we want, but dismissing it outright is inappropriate for a scientist. I mean, that makes you a dogmatic individual. That makes you a priest. It doesn't make you a scientist. And anybody who, takes that tack continuously might as well just give back their PhD, because they've basically violated the oath of what it is that a scientist is supposed to do.
Right. I can understand the viewpoint that we should, for instance, assign a very low probability to the possibility that the multiple dimensions and the many worlds theory of quantum mechanics are causally connected and beings could travel between them. But it seems absolutely wrong to rule this out as an in principle possibility.
Yeah.
So I'm with you that it does not make sense for scientists to be atheists or extraterrestrialists in this case.
I think you've heard the similar things. Well, Thomas Kuhn and the Kuhnian revolution, that, ideas, bump up against reality, or reality bumps up against people's former ideas. And then suddenly everything changes. And on the other side of that cliff are, everybody now assumes that it was right. And how could anybody have seen it as anything different? Gandhi has a similar thing. First they laugh at you, first they mock you, then they fight you, etc. I forget what the steps are, but the same idea being that it requires somebody or groups of somebodies to be steadfast and holding on to the value of an idea until it's formally disproven. And if you say, well, Gary, why are you ruining your career doing this? It's like, well, ruined what career? I just won the Lifetime Achievement Award here at Stanford in the name and honor of two people who I was, in awe of.
Congratulations,
Paul Berg and Arthur Kornberg, two Nobel Prize winners here at Stanford in the biochemistry department.
Yeah, I mean, if one looks at your CV, it is very hard to find anybody who is more accomplished than you are in their field.
Well, it's nice to be a part of a group of individuals, none of us who look at the other in envy, because we all are secure in our accomplishments. I don't need to prove anything to anybody. And having done all of that, I now, and having taught, cadres of students and other professors how to do a lot of these technologies, how to think about stuff in a different way, because I do math and computers as well as the biology. It's like, okay, where's a mountain I haven't scaled yet? And so proving or disproving that something like aliens or interdimensional or whatever are here would be the cherry on top of the cherry on top of the cake for me. And I have the time, I have the resources, I have the connections. I work with the government on this stuff. I know the people in the government who are doing it, and I have a top secret clearance. I deal with this stuff.
That's pretty cool.
And so it's like, but I can't say some of the things I know, but I also know that there's whole groups of people in the government who want to get the information out. So we're all working to do it legally. Or if we don't wait for daddy government to do it for us, then let's just do it ourselves, because the information's out there as to how to do this.
Okay, I'm salivating, waiting to get to all of that evidence. There are two last things, though, that I want to make sure we touch on before we move to that evidence. And just because I think they're important when having this UAP conversation. And I mean, parenthetically, I've had something like 250 episodes of this show. I have interviewed some of the brightest minds in the world. I spoke with Noam Chomsky, for instance, and plenty of Nobel winners. I spoke with Danny Kahneman. The reason that I've gone 250 episodes without having this conversation is not because I think that this is an unimportant conversation. I think the question of extraterrestrial life is among the most important conversations that we could be having. Is that I was waiting until I had the opportunity to talk about it with somebody like you, who is so well established that people have to take what you say seriously, myself included. And that's why I'm taking the care to really establish this before we get into the details. And the last two things that I want to talk about, the first one is the Fermi Paradox. And so I just wanted to ask, for our listeners who haven't heard about it, what is the Fermi Paradox? And then how do you resolve it or think about it?
Right. Well, Fermi was an astrophysicist or astronomer, I think I'm right about that, who basically said, well, if they're here and if the universe had so much opportunity, they should be everywhere and we should be able to see them. And so the Fermi Paradox came with an equation, which he assigned values to the probability of life, the probability of the number of planets, the number of suns in the universe or in the galaxy, et cetera. And you run the numbers, and the fact that we don't see anything means that the numbers would have to be smaller than we thought they were. Well, we know the number of planets is high. We know that the opportunity for life is now high. So what we thought when he wrote the first equation is different than what we believe it is now. And so yet we're still up against the idea that we don't see them. We don't see, lights in the sky everywhere we look.
Radio signals, what have you. Dyson spheres.
So let's, Dyson spheres. I mean, it's Dyson spheres. I mean, come on. I mean, that's just like, it's like, if you've achieved a level of technology, you don't need to collect it from the sun. You probably can access the 0-point field.
Right.
So you don't need to do that. So I actually, with Jacques Vallee, wrote a paper to SETI about this, saying, well, maybe two things. The answer is it shouldn't be a search for intelligence or life. It should be a search for consciousness, first of all. And so where can consciousness reside? So Boltzmann Brains might be, we're looking at suns or planets, whereas they might just as well be in intergalactic space. It could be a pub somewhere in the middle between Andromeda Galaxy and here where all the Boltzmann Brains hang out. So
Could be.
could be, metaphorically. And so maybe we're looking in the wrong place. Maybe a safe place to be would be at the center of a sun. If you could manipulate gravity and space and time, you could just as easily be in the middle of the sun as you could be on a planet. Why is the surface of a planet any good, necessarily?
Lots of impacts there.
Lots of impacts. I mean, if you have a long time civilization, you probably have learned the lesson and go underground or go under the ocean or go somewhere else. So, and yet the methods that we're using to look for it is essentially electromagnetic, right? I mean, and even us today, we're emitting less electromagnetics than we were a few decades ago, right? That is, I mean, we use low power because why use power that could reach Alpha Centauri if you can signal your satellite with Bluetooth or something, right? Equivalent. So we use fiber optics, et cetera. So the window within which we went from signaling with fire, signaling with electromagnetics, to now thinking about quantum teleportation and what is it? Oh my God. Entanglement, right, for information transfer. It has only been like, went from mud huts to that in 1,000 years.
Yeah.
And
Remarkable.
so that window is so short that there could be a million galaxies, a million civilizations out there, and it flashed by before we had the means to even detect it. So it just doesn't bother me. And so, and people talk about the wow signal. That was what the wow signal was when SETI was first set up. There were some signals that came that looked like they were from, they were what they were looking for, the radio frequencies that they were looking for, like Jodie Foster in Contact. And yet it was transient and didn't repeat. And so that was called the wow signal. Maybe the wow signal is already in the skies above us. They're showing up, but why do they need to come and talk to us? I mean, when you move into a house, and let's say there were a race of intelligent ants at the bottom of your garden, do you feel you need to establish diplomatic relations with the ants? No.
Sometimes it feels that way.
So yeah, but it's like we don't ask anybody's permission to do anything because we believe we're superior. So what happens if somebody else is superior to us? And they say, well, why should we ask? Why do we need to show up on their White House lawn? They're primitives. Mm-hmm. Why should we bother? But then that comes back to also the term alien. I mean, alien means alien. If you were to talk to those ants, how would you do it? How could you talk to them about Instagram? They talk to each other via chemical cues. How do you translate your mode of thinking to another species that has wholly different assumptions about how the universe might operate? So, why do we believe that they need to show themselves to us? They apparently have been, at least if you believe some of the evidence. And I sort of see it as an IQ test. Can you see us for what we are? When you're ready to see us for what we are, then we'll show up. But, you're still shooting each other. So why should we come down and deal with you guys? I frankly don't even think that anything that might be here is even who might have actually sent the stuff or who's in control. I think you would, if we were to talk to those ants, we'd probably make an avatar that looked like an ant. So I think that whatever it is that we see, or we might be thinking that we're seeing, could just as easily be an avatar created by something, a Boltzmann brain. Maybe the Boltzmann brains just basically instantiate something material for the purposes of interacting with the flatlanders.
One of the things, now that we're moving on to the dessert, which, I mean, in this context, there's a lot of dessert to talk about here. But when I asked for recommendations, books that I might read in preparation for this conversation, I was very surprised by what you suggested. I had anticipated some of the more popular books like Chariots of the Gods, but instead all of the texts that you recommended had to do with governments and national security. And in particular, a book called UFOs and Government. UFOs and Government, a Historical Inquiry by Michael Swords et al. Is one of them. But first of all, something that I should say is that I think that our listeners, viewers, if they're interested in this topic, they should look at this book. What I was struck by was how thoroughly researched and pretty neutral it was. I was expecting that all of this research would immediately be just assuming that aliens existed and then seeking to drag it out of the data. But this was a legitimate historical inquiry into how the United States government and other governments around the world have reacted to the very real phenomena of reports of UFOs, of extraterrestrials, UAPs. And what I wanted to ask you, though, before we talk about maybe some of these books and other books, is why you recommended that I read books about national security and UAPs for the purposes of this conversation.
Well, I think because we're talking about national security, the data collection of national security is on par, if not better, in many cases, than what happens in the science. So what you have are records. You have a discipline around the collection of those records. You have a chain of command that responds to something that might be a threat. And so therefore you have increased attention paid to it. And so the reason why these books around national security are so good is because they are as detailed, because the records exist. Somebody in the Department of Defense or the military collected those, saved them, and they're still there. They're on microfiche, or they're now available online, et cetera. And so you can go back and research them, do correlations, figure out what's going on. But you then have people, again, who I've said this earlier, we depend upon them for our national defense. We pour trillions of dollars into the coffers of these organizations to defend us and to collect the data. And so when you have pilots and heads of the Air Force, James Clapper just came out and said, yeah, this stuff is real. We don't know what it is, but it's real. He hinted he knew what it was, but he just didn't go there. You have Marco Rubio, now our Secretary of State, literally on film, one that I just saw in Austin, the movie that's coming out, Age of Disclosure by Dan Farah. Marco Rubio and Senator Rounds, 20 minutes total talking about this stuff, saying it's real.
Really?
Yeah. Marco Rubio.
Yeah.
All right. This is not a man who is just going to be saying these things because he thinks it's funny.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so I advise when it comes out, I think Dan is looking for a distributor now. It was at South by Southwest. It was the feature premiere film, South by Southwest. So he, I mean, who are you going to believe, me or your Secretary of State?
I obviously have not done the level of research on these topics that you have. So when I first looked at this book, I was just shocked by the sheer volume of reports out there coming from not just civilians, but military members. And I mean, the books that I looked at began around World War II, and there have just been, I mean, the numbers are really staggering, just the amount of reports. And again, whether or not these people really saw something that comes from some other civilization is not, that's not what matters right now. What matters to me is just the volume is just really amazing.
And so that's where, when I say the evidence is overwhelming,
Mm-hmm.
is that you can brush off one or two, but you have a hard time brushing off all of that. You also have a hard time brushing off newspaper reports going back to the early 1900s, where you get these repeating stories of a farmer saw this silver object in his field. He went out to the object. There was a little man next to it. The little man saw him and then jumped in the thing and took off. An otherwise credible individual. And this is like from the Kansas local town paper.
Right.
Before they even knew what these things were called. In the early 1900s, this was going on. You have this story in Zimbabwe of the aerial school, where, and there's a beautiful movie made of it, where 60 children, black and white, at this interracial school, something landed near their schoolyard, and these little guys came out and thought at them. What a fascinating story. A psychiatrist from Harvard, John Mack, went and interviewed them, and he's a specialist in child psychiatry, and said, these children aren't lying. They ran into the school, told the teachers came out, teachers didn't see anything, but then the kids drew what they saw. The story's all corroborated. And these are like 6 to 10-year-old kids.
Yeah.
Who just don't have it in them to lie like that. And the movie is actually, it happened around, I think, 1990 or something. 30 years later, go back to these kids who are now grown up, and they say, yeah, it happened, and it changed my life.
This raises, another series of very important meta questions about science. And the questions that I have in mind here are how we're supposed to establish the reputability or believability, credibility of a witness, and how we should factor that into our evidence. Surely the huge volume is something that we really need to take into account here. But when evaluating a single case, off camera, you mentioned that you've had some more recent UAP experiences. Maybe we'll talk a bit about those later. But first, you mentioned at the outset of our interviews that as a paperboy, you had a UAP experience. And I think now might be an interesting time to hear about that experience.
Right.
And then I'll follow up on this.
Right. So I was probably 12 years or so old, circa 1970 something, 74 or so. And it was early morning, and I had to get a paper to this one guy at the end of the street that I lived on, Sheffield Drive. And between his house and the next street I needed to go to was a sort of a little copse of woods, but I needed to get the paper there by 5:30 because he needed it by 5:30. And if I didn't get it there by 5:30, he complained to the office. So I know what time it had to have been. And then it was probably March or so, because back then, the snow was kind of on the ground, but it wasn't, wasn't lots of snow. And I was walking through the woods. This area always kind of scared me, but I was walking through the woods, and then I noticed my shadow in front of me, and the branches and the trees, and then the shadows were moving like that, suddenly they're coming close, and I realized there's what? And I looked up, and this object went right over the top of the trees. I didn't know what it was. I still don't know what it was, except it couldn't have been a blimp, because if it were a blimp or any kind of airship, I lived in a hilly region. It would have crashed another 200 feet away where it was. And so, and it wasn't until literally decades later when I kind of became aware of UFOs in the, in the zeitgeist of pop culture, that I looked back and said, was that what I saw? It was the lights, and it was kind of, you could kind of see the shadow of it against the sky. Um, it's an anecdote, but it is not explainable. It was totally silent, totally silent. Didn't stop. Nobody got out. I didn't have any missing time or anything like that. But it was enough to solidify in my mind later that these are the kinds of events that people have. Mine are nowhere near as dramatic as a lot of what other people claim. But it solidified that it needs an explanation. And so that's part of what drives me, is like, I don't need anybody else to validate what I saw. And I don't need anybody else to validate why I should be asking the question. So let's just do it. And, but then I come across people who've had much more, personal contact with objects or things or claimed beings, etc. And so I just collect the stories. But I don't have to be the one collecting the stories. You've seen that book, some of the ones that I gave you. But then there's like books by Jacques Vallee or Richard Dolan. Richard Dolan is a fantastic historian. Just he's writing a series of books on USOs, unidentified submerged objects.
Oh, really?
And he takes hundreds of stories that have been collected over the decades. He's done all the nitty-gritty research, details each of them, but he's a fantastic writer, so he interweaves with his own kind of humor and writing, so it's an engaging read. It's not just a read of facts. Then there's Jacques Vallee, who wrote a book called Wonders in the Sky. And what he did was work with a librarian of international history who went back through the records. God knows how they found this stuff. Hundreds, thousands of years, finding examples of events that we would today classify as a UFO, but written by the generals, the historians, the kings, the scientists of the time, and recorded on parchment or literature, in the literature. One of the most fantastic is Alexander the Great. In one of his battles, these bright shields showed up in the sky above us. And we saw it as an omen of our eventual win. There's a story in Japan of an object that basically washes up on shore and a woman gets out of it. It's weird. And this is where someone like Jacques Vallee comes in and tells us, you need to forget about all this alien stuff, even interdimensional stuff. You're dealing with a phenomena that almost acts like a form of consciousness, which, as he puts it, fantastic thing is that to them, reality is negotiable. So again, what you're really talking about, as he presents it, is something like a Boltzmann brain, some sort of force that has an ability to make itself be seen as almost anything it wants to. And his hypothesis or thesis is that, back when we were incredibly primitive, we saw these things as the spirits in the forest. Then we saw them as gods. Then we have God, right? We don't believe in God necessarily anymore. Plenty of people do. I'm not disparaging it. Now we believe in technology, and aliens represent technology. So maybe what we're dealing with is something that is just saying, I'm here. Those of you who are smart enough to recognize what it is that you see, I can engage with you. But you are not alone. So the constant message across time is you're not alone. Mm-hmm. Again, it's just an idea. And it, to me, is kind of particularly feels poetic to put it that way. And what I like about that kind of approach is, there's this story in South America when the conquistadors first showed up at the shore that the people at the time, who were not primitive, couldn't recognize the ships for what they were.
Right.
Right? But at that moment, their world became both larger and smaller. Larger because they were part of something, smaller because they were less than what they thought they were.
Yeah, I think they famously described the ships as clouds or
Yeah.
something like that. When they saw men on horseback, they just couldn't fathom
They
what this
couldn't
was.
fathom. You couldn't see it. And so, I know of plenty of people who were, stories where somebody sees it and the others just don't see it. Because it's like the mirror test for an animal in the jungle. You put a mirror and only animals of a certain intelligence level are capable of understanding eventually that it's them in the mirror.
Right.
And so I see this again as an intelligence test. And one of the things that I find most fascinating is sort of a thread through many of the, let's call them encounter stories, is somebody says, I saw a light in the distance. And when I saw it, it started getting closer. And it's almost as if when you see it, it knows that it sees you. And then it says, here's somebody who can see me. I'm going to go show them. I'm the data off the curve. And there's somebody intelligent enough to recognize that the data's off the curve, that I'm not just a star. I didn't just walk by.
I'm going to tell my own anecdote very briefly. And when I was a child, I had, for, I don't know, a period of a few months or a year maybe, when I was, I don't know, 10, 11, I had really intense night terrors where I would sleepwalk and I had these recurring dreams that there were aliens just somewhere above me, sending threatening messages that they were going to kill everyone. And I would run around screaming, and my parents would have to like hold me down, and they were worried I would jump out of the window. And eventually I had to go on lorazepam, like an anti-seizure medication, just because these were really intense night terrors. And I can very easily imagine, so I don't believe that they were aliens I think I was just having bad dreams, but I can easily imagine myself not having this belief and thinking that this was something real, much more substantial than I do in fact believe. And this, I imagine, is a large problem with children who are presumably they're less developed than adults and more likely to believe things that are not happening are in fact happening. And so what I'm wondering is how you have looked back on your own experience and ruled out the possibility that something much more mundane, like a daydream or a hallucination or anything else, could account for what you observed coming over the trees.
There's just no dreaming
Mm-hmm.
of what happened. So I don't even need to reevaluate it at this point. What it was, I don't know, but that it happened is for sure. But to your point, though, I'm going to actually challenge your point of that children are subject to hysteria, let's say.
Okay.
What happens if the stories, I mean, your story might be because you were already inculcated with TV and the pop culture idea of what they are. So you were immediately able to put monsters in the form of aliens, into your closet,
Right.
essentially, or under your bed. But what happens if the stories come from children in the 1940s, 1950s, before there were television? In the 1960s, we had 3 channels on my black and white TV when I was a kid. So how do you explain a commonality of a story? I mean, you could maybe call it a Jungian, collective unconscious if you want. But why do they form as aliens with the same features? So maybe, I'm just going to challenge what you're saying, maybe it's young people, as you said, are not formed. not grown up, because they're not indoctrinated
Right.
into not seeing it
Hmm.
or not hearing it. Maybe you were sensitive.
I think if you took somebody like Neil deGrasse Tyson, for instance, and we're just imagining a hypothetical scenario. If an actual UFO,
Somebody smarter than Neil deGrasse Tyson, because
okay, well, we can imagine some brilliant non-UFO believing in scientists. If a UFO or an actual alien spacecraft, again, this is just a hypothetical, zoomed across the sky, and this person saw it, they would absolutely believe that they did not see it. They would say, okay, this was a comet or something like that. Whereas a child would be much more open to the possibility that this was an extraterrestrial craft. So I take your point. That is an interesting.
But how about this? So, we talked about, I mean, I see you, and you are, really just a collection of particles that have no actual form, right? You just, at a higher level, you have matter, and I perceive you as a person. But at the end of the day, there's nothing there. You're just
Yeah.
a bunch of waves, and we interact with each other through waves. Well, what happens if there's senses below yet still our full understanding using physics that are just on the edge of believability, that are actually the manner by which these things interact? So there's, and let's address one thing. There's claimed telepathy with these things. Well, I don't think that means it's magic. I just think that means it's a kind of technology that we don't. I mean, I can, there are devices that can transmit sound into your head from a distance, right? Use the resonance cavity and transmit sound, to you. So, again, Elon Musk is making a neural link. And maybe a sufficiently advanced civilization can reach into your brain with electromagnetics very finely targeted and can manipulate your brain in a way that allows you to hear or see things. I have no problem believing that somebody a million years ahead of us might have achieved that level of sophistication.
I accept that this is certainly a possibility, but the question is, how likely should we think it is that this is possible?
I assign no probability. I just
You just
say,
want to.
I just want to have it on the table.
Hmm.
And it's like, okay, well, because I started, as you know, the Soul Foundation with a couple of other individuals, and one of the questions I posed to the audience during one of my talks was, okay, here we have an extraordinarily broad range of phenomena that need explanation. What kind of universe has to exist to explain them? And that's really what I'm saying, is that you have a phenomenon, and you don't have to say that the phenomenon is real. You just have to say what has to be so that the phenomena could exist. And once you know that it can be, or you think that it can be, that allows you to design experiments and instruments to address whether it's true or not. And that's the fundamentals of how science operates. Is like when I look at, my day job is reverse engineering human biology, trying to understand how human biology goes wrong in the context of cancer, and why the immune system gets dislodged from its normal function of wiping out precancerous cells. And that's, so I'm constantly thinking of, okay, what is this? What is it? So what kind of universe exists in the body of how cells signal interact with each other through some complex interplay that allows for this to happen where cancer takes over? Or how, when you trigger the immune system this way, it eradicates the cancer. So that same thought process I apply to these other problems. And so, again, I would beseech your audience to say and realize, I'm not telling them that anything that I've said is true. I'm saying it's a possibility. And if you have a better way of putting it together, I want to hear it.
Hmm. Well, the last question, though, I want to ask about the credibility of witnesses before we move on is, so when I am talking to you and I hear you telling me this story about your encounter, I have many years of experience dealing with other people. I think I have a pretty good grasp on when people are telling the truth, and you seem entirely believable and honest about this. But I imagine that in these many, many thousands and thousands of reports that the US government collected, some of them are not credible. And what I'm wondering is this just where the numbers come in, where certainly you have to discount some number of these claims, but once you have a huge volume of them, you no longer really need to care about the credibility of any individual
Correct.
witness.
Correct. You know, and unfortunately, the problem is that the more spectacular claims that can be disproven are the ones that are used to paint the credible with that tainted brush. And so, you know, there's nothing you can do about that. We're dealing, you know, we're dealing with humans, and at the end of the day, to me, it doesn't matter if anybody else believes me or believes that what I think is possible might be true, because I'm on a mission to do it myself, right? And I'm on a mission with other people who are as compelled as I am to prove or disprove this with the money to back it. And so our answer is, we don't care what you think. We're going to do it ourselves. And by the way, if we get technology, you're going to benefit. We might make money on the technology, but you're going to benefit in the long run. So we're in it for you. We're not in it for us.
Okay, so now that we have this question about witnesses, I think adequately dealt with, I do want to return now to the governments that have been collecting these reports. And while I suspect that we will focus on the American government, I found it very interesting that these books you sent me surveyed governments from around the world that were collecting very similar data, and in some cases almost the same data in different places. But the first question I'd like to ask in this regard is there a general pattern for how the United States government responded to all of these reports it received?
Well, for a while, it was a priority to collect the data, until it apparently became a priority to collect the data but suppress that it had been collected.
Interesting.
And that was circa the time that somebody realized that this might represent a technology that, if used in the right or wrong way, could have military implications in terms of, you know, I mean, look, if you can instantly go from 0 to 5,000 miles an hour, you win the war. You know, if you can, as in some circumstances it's been shown, if you can drain a battery at a distance of any type, lead, lithium, etc., to 0, you win the war.
Was that something UAPs were doing?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And if you can do any of the things that these things do, you win the war. And so it is the responsibility of a government to war game scenarios. And so, you know, but as you mentioned, it's not just the US. Several of the major countries in NATO have records like this. Brazil has an extraordinary number, and probably one of the most celebrated cases in Brazil. There's two, actually. One is the Varginha episode, where multiple individuals saw this object in the city of Varginha, as well as a supposed entity of some kind. Great movie, by the way, by James Fox. And then there was the Colares episode at the mouth of the Amazon, one of the towns near the mouth of the Amazon, where over a series of a few weeks, villagers were claiming these objects were showing up and zapping them and doing things. And then the Brazilian military showed up and has pictures of all this stuff coming out of the Amazon and et cetera. And then
And I'm sure you've got plenty of witnesses for this
oh, they
one.
had lots of witnesses for that. And so, it's just, I mean, part of me is like, well, why would these objects bother? What are they up to? Why would the Brazilian military feel it necessary to suppress the information? You have China, which is probably the most opaque of the places where data has been collected, but they established their own UAP investigation group just last year, formal.
Really?
Yeah. Of course, the Soviet Union. And I mean, how many more do you need? Of people to collect this kind of data. But I think the people I know who claim to work on the legacy program, who were brought together for a meeting to say, should we let this information out, came to the conclusion that the risk of letting the information out was too great. And at least twofold. One is it would upset the world order if you realize that you're not the top of the intellectual chain, right? And calls into question whether humanity can protect itself from such a thing. I don't think we need to protect ourselves. If they wanted to wipe us out, and anybody with those kinds of capabilities could just do it like that. So that doesn't even bother me that they have malignant or malevolent intent. But then the other side is that access to such technology could give anybody basically the equivalent of a thermonuclear bomb in terms of energy opportunity. I mean, if you can go from zero to, if you can move a 1-ton object, from the surface of the ocean to space in less than a second, which is what some of the observations have shown. There's recordings of this, right? Radar recordings of this. Pilots who all say that this is what happened. If you calculate the energy requirement, it's like the entire thermonuclear output of the United States for a year. Kevin Knuth basically did this calculation. He's a physicist in New York. So if anybody has that, you could drop such a thing on a city and done. So that's a valid reason for not letting technology out. But I'm interested, and I've proposed, so the US government, 3 years in a row, and Senator Schumer and Senator Rounds tried to get this out. There was a UAP Disclosure Act, which literally 60 pages has in it listed everything from, you're going to release all the reverse engineering of alien technology. I mean, literally it says that in the act. You're going to release all the information. We're going to establish a board that I was to be nominated on to oversee the release of the information in a controlled manner. It was about to get passed, but then, believe it or not, 2 Republican Congress people came and lobbied against it, and they were the head of the intelligence agency, the Intelligence Committee, and the head of Armed Services. And they lobbied against it, and then all the aerospace companies came in and said, no, you can't talk about this. I mean, literally, they lobbied. Said, no, we shouldn't let this information out. This is in the open press information. So why, if there's nothing there, would you have the aerospace companies who have been reputed to have had access to this stuff lobby against it? And why would 2 Republican Congress people do so when you have people like Moskowitz, Democrat, Nancy Mace, and others yelling at their counterparts saying, we have to let this information out? I mean, Moskowitz literally said, disclosure today, disclosure tomorrow, disclosure forever. This information needs to be let out.
I know that this question was rhetorical, but I'm going to ask it anyway. I mean, what is the answer? What would the aerospace companies have to gain from this? What do you actually think?
Well, I mean, forget anti-gravity and forget traveling, blah, blah, blah. Do you have material alloys, for instance, that have properties that we might want to use for our own planes, even if it has nothing to do with anti-gravity? And my big push, and part of my push, for the UAP Disclosure Act, was the creation of a public-private partnership opportunity where if the aerospace companies have this stuff, and if, let's say, that they were siphoning off money or otherwise misappropriating funds, or taking a technology and then not letting the government know what it is that they've discovered from it, and then claiming patents around it. So maybe there's some illegalities there. What do you do about that? Now 40 years later, maybe you need to offer amnesty to these groups so that they can come let the information out. Because maybe the materials, even if they're not working, just studying them, like reverse engineering a cell, we don't understand how the body works, but I can still figure out what some of the proteins are doing. So maybe I can figure out something about how the metals are made that I could deploy in my own industries. Wouldn't that be a great opportunity? Just studying how somebody else made something. Mm-hmm. The claims from the inside is this stuff is actually engineered at the atomic level, literally put together at the atomic level.
Wow.
We don't have anything like that.
Nothing close to it.
No, we just don't move atoms. You see the beginnings of it in like Nature or Science, where somebody picked up an atom and put it there, and they make the word IBM on it, out of, moving some atoms around. We don't have that ability yet.
So there are claims, I mean, we saw at the beginning of the episode, the beginning of the conversation that will soon become an episode, how thoroughly you investigated and how seriously you took the claim that the Atacama Mummy was extraterrestrial. And I'm wondering, do you have claims that you really have vetted, really think are believable, that the government is in possession of alloys of this nature that we couldn't have created ourselves?
Only stories from people who can't come forward right now.
But you believe them?
But I believe that they're telling me what they think is the truth.
Okay.
But
and I appreciate how careful you are in saying this.
Yeah, you have to be, and because otherwise you'll get cornered. Mm-hmm. And the best scientist creates 1,000 exits to their argument because they don't want to get cornered.
Right. Something that I often hear, and I admit to feeling this sentiment at times, when I listen to interviews like this, people seem cagey and they don't want to come out and say, oh, we've got this footage, but we can't show it to you, and it sometimes can come off as, oh, they're just really not confident, or they're hiding something, or they're lying. But what I really appreciate, what I'm getting from you, is that, no, you're just very careful and you don't want to make claims that you can't fully stand behind. Some of the claims you're making, you can fully stand behind them, like the anecdote you shared with us, or some of the things about Skywatcher maybe that we'll get to. But I was asking about how seriously you take the claims that the government is in possession of alloys that we could have not produced ourselves.
Okay, so there are public materials from claimed events. So one of them is the Council Bluffs, Iowa. An object was seen by multiple people above a lake near an airport. It was hovering, lights, etc. Something was seen to drop from it, and so they thought it was a plane crash. They showed up. There was, several tens of pounds of molten metal on the ground. How did it get there? I have the metal. I have the original, pictures.
You personally do?
I personally. I published literally the world's first peer-reviewed academic article on analysis of a UAP material. Mm-hmm. Now, I found nothing extraterrestrial about it. It looked like slag. But what was fascinating about it was that it was a mixture of iron, titanium, aluminum, and a few other things. But it was not homogeneous. It wasn't like somebody put it in a blender and made, a homogeneous mixture. It was like somebody took a whole bunch of ingots of this stuff, partially melted them, mushed them around, and then dumped them overboard. And so I published, the mass spectrometry analysis of that and made no claims as to what it was. Just here's the data. Because maybe somebody 10 years from now will figure it out. But what's fascinating about that particular story is that I have medals from about 3 or 4 different incidents like that, where people see this stuff being dropped from the objects and they go and they show up and there's this molten metal on the ground. Well, what does that mean? I don't know what it means. Maybe it tells us something about what they're doing or how they propel or power their craft, or maybe it's the exit it from their microwaves. I don't know. I just don't know what it is, but it's a commonality. I have a material from Ubatuba, Brazil, a fisherman who saw an object that dropped something, and partway of it dropping, it exploded all over the beach. He collected some of it, chunks of it, and I have pieces of it from 2 chains of evidence and I did something called atomic probe tomography on it, which is basically you can see literally the positions of the atoms in it. It's 99.99% silicon. 99.999% silicon. 1950 something. Who makes silicon at that level of purity, explodes it over a beach in Brazil? Who makes that level of purity? Silicon Valley makes that level of purity, but only in the last 20 or 30 years. Okay, so, and one of the 2 chains of evidence had magnesium isotope ratios that are way off Earth normal. I have no idea what it means. But what I do know what it means is that it was engineered and made by somebody or something, right? And it's just a fact. So I don't have an explanation for what it is, but I have the material, right? And anybody else can use this. The material is in several people's hands. I have another material, the so-called bismuth magnesium material from supposedly claimed to be from Roswell. I've had students who shall go unnamed who have been analyzing this stuff. It's engineered with a level of precision and made of things that we just wouldn't put together. Layered magnesium oxide with bismuth interlaces. I mean, I have in the material. We have done all the most advanced analyses you could imagine on them. No idea how anybody would make it. That piece is about as close to technology as anything I have. The other pieces are kind of like something that was left over. This is not. We have chunks of this stuff.
If you manage to get hold of this with your resources, I can only imagine that what the origin of the materials are, I couldn't say, but that the government has a lot of stuff and a lot of very interesting things. So it makes sense to me that the government might suppress the information that it had collected and suppress that it had been collecting this information for this reason as part of national security, that these things might be very valuable, whether it's for military technology or for airplane, anything like that.
Just advancing your own industrial base.
But another thing that I wanted to ask about was what I read about in the text was that it could produce mass hysteria or be used as psychological warfare. And I'm wondering what you think about that in connection to national security.
Well, we know through social media today that you can basically lie about anything and convince people. Propaganda works. I'm less worried about, maybe in the 1950s, you might be worried about, hysteria about aliens, et cetera, or something else.
War of the Worlds.
War of the Worlds, exactly what went through my head. But I think that today people, if it doesn't put food or take food from their table, they'll probably pay attention to it for a week. But if the government is not running around with its hair on fire, they'll probably go on to other things, because just the statement that something is here, or that, whatever they are real, has already been done. I mean, the government has said, I'm not kidding you, US government has said UAP are real. The phenomenon is real. There's a report that comes out every year that lists a number of things that just can't be explained. So they are by definition UAP. They're not identified, but they're not prosaic. They're not explainable by anything that we have. And so the government has been playing this very interesting kind of almost legalistically, lawyerly verbiage game where they say, well, we have no proof that it's aliens. Okay, well, what happens if it's ultra-terrestrials? Are you using the term aliens as a way to hide what it is that it really is? Because maybe it's Boltzmann Brains, right? You go back and you look at everything that they've said. They always say, oh, we have no proof that it's aliens. Yeah, but you have no proof. At a certain point in time, you have to use the old Sherlock Holmes statement. When everything else is taken off the table, even the most unlikely thing is probably the right thing. And so, that's not a scientific argument, except it is, because that's what a lot of the papers in science are all about. They're like, we've disproven everything we think that it can't be. And so the only thing left is what we think it is. So, at a certain point, it's not up to me to convince anybody of anything. In fact, I say this, I'm not here to convince anybody. I'm just asking people to think and to use your God-given neurons to push through the logic of the problem.
While we're on the topic of the government and UAPs, there are two broad classes of evidence that they collected that I don't think that we will talk much about elsewhere in our conversation, so I just wanted to flag them and ask about them now. And what I have in mind are abductions and animal mutilations. And to me, they're much more outlandish, I would say, than claims of just seeing something overhead or something exploding that seem more in the realm of the everyday in a certain sense. But the reports often claim that black unmarked helicopters were seen around the time of the animal mutilations, things like this. And so I'm just wondering how you view these two sorts of events, or you don't.
They're just data. I really, I think for the same reasons that you feel it's almost off topic, or it's like, it's so extraordinary to imagine that, something like that might be going on. I mean, I can certainly create a world where it happens mentally. But as a scientist, I don't feel it's my responsibility nor prudent to go there until I address some of the more addressable issues, like medical harm. I can take the same MRI of the same person and show that the same thing that thing happened to them, and I can compare it to 100 other people where they claim the same thing. I can take materials, I can take a piece of that material, lop it off, give it to another scientist, and they can find out the same thing that I did. You take the Atacama Mummy, somebody take another piece of that skin, do the same study, and prove me right or wrong, which is, we're now 11 or 12 years after that, and the people who claim that I was a fraud, they have yet to disprove me. So I dare them. I dare them. And he who shall not be named know who I'm talking about. So, because I know I'm right. So it's like, we have to address the things that are scientifically addressable. I can't address right now telepathy. Other people might be able to. I can't address claimed abductions, or I had a government agency come to me, in the last year asking for my help with claimed implants. So I want nothing to do with them.
And again, I really do appreciate the intellectual honesty here, because the interview would be much more exciting if you told me that, oh, you'd been abducted Oh,
Yeah, no,
your pet
yeah,
was
no, and I would
mutilated.
no, and I haven't, I guess luckily, or whatever. But it's no, and I'm going to get probably savaged for saying it, because there's the whole so-called experiencer community and abduction community who want me to address it, and it's just I cannot address it because it's a psychological issue. First of all, not that they have a mental health issue. It's just, it's an anecdote. And I need something which has, now, what's fascinating about it are the commonalities of the stories. So that has and rings an element of truth throughout the whole issue. But it's, again, it's not scientifically in my purview. And second, I can't do everything. I know what I can do. And so I do it. Now, John Mack, the Harvard psychiatrist, addressed it, back in the day. And, he basically, and he's dead now, unfortunately, but I use his rubric of, I don't know if what they're saying is right, but I know they believe that what they're saying is right. And, at the very least, we need to address the trauma associated first with what they claimed happened to them, and second, the trauma of family, friends, and society not believing what it is that they're saying. So those are separate but related, obviously.
Given what you've just said, I think that this is a good time then to turn to the things you've had your hands on, figuratively and really. So let's return to what you started off with quite early in the conversation, which is some of these pilots whose brains you scanned. And so can we start from the beginning with how you got tapped to do this?
Well, again, it was because I had, well, what they were doing, the government was doing, were full medical evaluations of these individuals. And one of the evaluations they wanted was a blood analysis. And so they asked around and they said, who makes the best blood analysis? Who does the best blood analysis? Oh, you need to go talk to this guy Nolan at Stanford. He invented this device called blah, blah, blah. Co-invented. The actual inventor gets mad at me when I say I invented it. He invented it. Scott, you invented it. Scott Tanner, University of Toronto. Great guy. He brought it to me, and then I turned it into an immunology tool. And so they said, go talk to this guy. He's got this all worked up and operating. And so that's how I got officially brought in. And because I didn't run them out of the room screaming, and I returned their phone calls afterwards.
The government?
The government. After we started, now I advise several groups. And not because I'm certainly not the kind of physicist that they need. And they have better physicists working on the problem, literally.
Of
in the so-called legacy program.
But working on the health issues or on propulsion
No, working on
issues?
propulsion,
Okay,
and,
propulsion.
and that stuff. And so, one of the things I think is interesting about understanding what might happen to people if they get too close to some object radiating some strange effect is it tells you something about the engine. I mean, if you stand behind a fighter jet while it's about to take off on an aircraft carrier, you're going to have scorched burns across your body. Now, if I didn't know that the fighter jet existed, I could at least understand that heat was involved in the production of the propulsion of the object that hurt them. So there's value to understanding what happens to these people. Yeah. But there was an interesting side observation that we made in looking at all of the brains of these individuals, which was we noticed a common feature in their basal ganglia at the head of the caudate putamen of a neural density cluster that was not seen in everyday people. And what eventually we found that it was it's an indication of a form of intelligence. and intuition. It's actually this area of the brain is involved in intuition. So when we figured out that this was intuition, it turned out that the medical community at large was also finding out that this was intuition. And the reason why it was concentrated in this group of individuals is because they're high-functioning individuals who need to work and use their intuition to operate in the environment in which they do. So it's nothing to do with UFOs or UAPs. It had to do with just their level of required functionality. It's interesting because it's the area of the brain that lights up when you have an intuitive leap. Now, that's kind of the value of basic research. We didn't go looking for that, but we found that. And then I later did a study with another group at Harvard with brains of normals, autistics, and schizophrenics as bookends to normal to show that, in fact, this feature was directly involved with intelligence. Because we had full medical and testing evaluations on all these people, but that there were alterations in the caudate putamen of these of the schizophrenics, sorry, or autistics, that we could actually create a pattern match for, and that the caudate putamen was involved in this. Now, why I find that interesting is that, from an intelligence standpoint, is, I know several functional autistics who are very, very, very smart, but as we know, autistics often have social interaction disorders. But we learned something about the caudate putamen there, and on the flip side, schizophrenics, maybe a lot of maybe a lot of the people who are in mental health institutions who are schizophrenics, maybe it's because they're just so creative that their brains go off into fantasy lands. But it's part of that spectrum. But that was and we published 3 papers on this. And that came because of the medical study that I did with the government at the time. So, and we contributed to the medical literature unexpectedly. And it had nothing to do with UAP.
Now, some of these pilots, I know that you do not want, and I totally understand why, you do not want to talk about particular people. But I'm wondering if, just so that I and our audience can get a better understanding of what these pilots claim to have experienced, can you give a sort of generic account of
No, because the number of people are so small that when I do, those individuals think I'm talking about them, and they and their family write me nasty emails.
Okay, but
and they are justified in doing so.
Okay.
When they first did it, because I didn't realize that it was resurfacing trauma that they had gone through.
Then maybe I can quite broadly say that what we're talking about is somebody perhaps flying a jet and they have some experience like yours where something passes nearby. They have no way of accounting for what it is. And then they feel very different and hurt afterward.
Right. Or they feel burns, or they feel like they get confused. Okay, let's again go back to this notion of how these things might move. So what happens if they are warping space and time? What happens if I passed a warped space-time, field across you? If it doesn't scramble you into putting, maybe it makes you feel a little disoriented. And so if you're flying a jet and need to make split-second decisions and you're disoriented, it's a flight risk for you, and reporting it is a flight risk. It's actually a career risk, because if you had an event like that happen and suddenly you're disoriented, it might be well within the rights of the flight doctor to say, all right, we're taking you off because we don't know what it is. We don't know that you're not going to just have this event happen again, and it has nothing to do with UFOs or UAP. It's just you had some sort of a break, a psychological break of some kind.
But some of these people, they did experience burns. They did have scarring in their brains. Has anything that you have observed in these patients either challenged your understanding of your conventional understanding of physics or
No,
biology?
no,
Or
it's. I mean, the white matter disease that we saw most frequently in the brain was random. In other words, not focused. Meaning that these people were exposed to a field effect that, depending upon where they were and relative to whatever happened, and then they had these white matter disease in their head, in their brain. Looks like multiple sclerosis. And you know, when we first saw briefly, back to that caudate putamen thing, that was the commonality, and we thought we'd found something. We found it was just sort of a side observation that had nothing to do with the damage per se. It just means that people like that. It's kind of like tall people are more likely to bump their head, on a short doorway. So you're a lot of tall people. If you have a lot of basketball players going through normal doorways, you're going to have a lot of people with bumped heads. It's kind of that effect.
But is there something that you have taken from these experiences that has raised your credence that these UAP are extraterrestrial in origin?
No, just that they're operating with field effects. I mean, yes. I mean that whatever it is, and it's a very small number, mind you, because I told you like 80 to 90 of them were simply Havana syndrome. That these things seem to be operating with field effects that are incongruous with any kind of weapon that you or I know about, right? I mean, how do I reach inside of your brain and cause, except with, say, a microwave gun, or I stick your head in a microwave and cook parts of your brain, right? I mean, these energy weapons, frankly exist. And, I know people who says we were developing them back in the 80s. I mean, you probably have read in the newspapers about people, these guns they have that can make you feel like your skin is burning, but your skin's not burning.
I did not know about
Yeah,
that.
that's true. Yeah, you can go look it up. And so it's just a microwave emitter of some kind. There's nothing magic about it. It's just technology that even we have. So, I mean, that's the only thing, is how did it happen? But because, again, it's not repeatable, and because I certainly don't want to do any kind of animal experiments that mimic it, because I just think it would be cruel to animals. But I mean, I wouldn't recommend, for instance, you going and camping out in your local, transformer, down at the bottom of your hill in one of those big transformer things, because the electromagnetic fields there would kill you. I mean, people are worried about cell phone towers and causing brain cancer. So nobody should be surprised that if an object is moving around with strong electromagnetic fields as part of its propulsion source, that it might cause damage to somebody. Who should be surprised?
You mentioned earlier that you have a top secret clearance, and I think you said you've worked or been tapped by the CIA. And what I'm wondering is that in connection to this work or in connection to other projects that you've been involved with the government?
That's why it's called TS.
Top secret. So other things that you can't
I just
talk
can't
about?
talk about it. No.
Okay.
No, I mean, I don't have. I mean, I'll just be honest. I do not have a level of clearance that allows me to walk into, Hangar 10 at Area 51 or anything like that. Nothing like that. But I have a kind of clearance that allows people to talk to me, in a secure information facility or from a secure information facility, and they feel that if they tell me something, I am bound by the rules of a TS. And I know nothing, and I've said nothing here that would ever breach anything like that.
Well, maybe you have information about these incidents that you can't share, which I would understand. But to me, the most interesting news about UAPs that has come out in the last years that I'm aware of, obviously, because I'm interested in it, is the Tic-Tac footage. just what were the incidents? What was the sequence of events, and how was the government involved?
The Tic-Tac incident was related to an event that occurred off the coast around one of our aircraft carriers, nuclear aircraft carriers.
Which is important.
Which is important. And it was observed by this guy by the name of David Fravor, who was a pilot, top pilot, who led a squadron. And he said he had never seen anything like it before, the way it maneuvered over the ocean, and how it moved. He's the one who basically said it, from our radar, it went from surface of this ocean to above, into near space instantly. And there were multiple corroborating radar signatures that, basically said what he was saying was apparently true. And that interestingly, when he was told to go to his contact point after the thing disappeared, where they will sort of rendezvous with the squadron, it was already there. That's interesting. It knew to be there. So what did it do? How did it know to go there? Because even they didn't know where they were going until they were told to go there. Did it reach into the computer systems and read the computer systems and say, look at what I can do? Did it read somebody's mind? I don't know, but that's the data. So again, it's up to the audience. If you don't believe the data, then I have nothing to say to you. But if you at least will accept that the data might be true, the onus is not on me only to come up with an explanation. If you don't, that's the fun of science, is to use your brain to come up with a reason why. And it's a collective effort. It's not just, I'm not here to bat answers back and forth with people.
Mm-hmm. And am I correct that there have been, it's not just this one pilot you mentioned, but many people who have...
Well, he and his co-pilot saw it, the person sitting behind him. And, another event with Ryan Graves on the East Coast, which was there were two other events that occurred where they didn't just see one object, they saw a fleet of them. And they saw them over several weeks, maneuvering and doing things that we're not supposed to be able to do, moving against the wind and just being stationary, and then just zipping off. And Ryan was so convinced that he said, this is a flight safety issue, not just for the military, but also for aviation, just general aviation. So he started a 501c3 called the Americans for Safe Aerospace, and worked with the American Association of Aerospace Engineers to get it as part of their 50,000 strong engineering group. So, you have to understand that when, like, I set up the Soul Foundation or other people set up these other organizations, they're doing it out of a conviction of what it is that they have experienced. And they're saying, look, I'm going to put my money and time and reputation and efforts where my mouth is. And so, it doesn't matter to me if other people will disparage. It's because I'm not here to make them happy. I'm here to make me happy.
And these objects that you mentioned, they were detected by radar. Were there other ways in which they were perceived as well?
Well, they were seen
by human eyes.
By eye.
And detected by radar at the same time.
And what's interesting is the reason why suddenly, so in the last decade or two, and especially around these incidents, we had upgraded our radar capabilities. We'd come up, because, we developed stealth, the Russians developed stealth, we developed anti-stealth radar, et cetera. So there's this back and forth of upgrading your capability. And it was when we upgraded our capabilities, suddenly this stuff was like everywhere.
Huh. That's fascinating.
Yeah. It correlated with our increased technical capability.
So this, I think, is very puzzling for the skeptic, because the skeptic has to acknowledge. Well, the first
I'm a
thing.
skeptic, by the way.
Yeah, I mean that's what the Atacama incident
Right.
tells us. But what the skeptic might say,
The
if it,
pseudo-skeptic.
the pseudo skeptic, if it's just radar, you can say there is a technological glitch. But as soon as you have multiple modes of detection that are disconnected, human eyes, radar, then
Well, and FLIR, so infrared. It was the other simultaneous one that was used to see some of these things.
and if you have three simultaneous modalities of detection,
Science.
science, then what do you think are the plausible competing explanations for what these Tic-Tacs were? And
Okay,
then
so
maybe we can rule some out.
okay,
But what's
so
plausible?
one of the things that happened at the end of that Tic-Tac event and the others is that some basically people showed up on the ship, helicoptered in, non-military, came in, said, "Give us all the data. We want the data. That's it. We're going with it." And that's it. And the data disappeared, literally, and didn't come out again until Lou Elizondo and Chris Mellon basically brought it out of the Pentagon. I actually was at a bar in Crystal City overlooking the Pentagon with Lou Elizondo 2 weeks before the New York Times videos came out, and he showed that stuff to me.
Oh wow.
So that was pretty cool. My hair stood on end. I was
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
holy Jesus.
Yeah.
And so I've known him since way back. And another man who's like, why should he ruin his career for this? Because he just thinks it's important.
And for our listeners who don't know who he is,
Lou Elizondo worked in General Mattis's office in the Department of Defense, a decorated counterintelligence agent. His day job was doing some really important stuff around terrorism. And this sort of assignment of looking into UAP was given to him as a side gig until he got, again, into the data so deep that he was like, this is important. And he was being ignored by his superiors. And that was when he resigned and put out a public statement. And then he worked behind the scenes to get the videos out.
no tenure in the U.S. government.
No tenure in the U.S. government. And disparaged, and they went after him. Same thing happened to David Grush, another very close friend of mine, who was tasked by Congress to go into to basically prove or disprove that there were programs related to UAP. And he found swaths of evidence and then was attacked by a number of people within the government. They removed his security clearances. He got them back because he actually got one of the heads of one of the top judicial administrators for Defense Intelligence Agency to basically protect him and to argue his case, and he won, at least so far. But then some people from apparently the government leaked his medical reports, and to try to basically disparage his mental health. So why do these people go to all of these lengths to hurt the ones who are coming out if there's nothing there? So what are they protecting? And every time they do something like that, that just gets who's ever doing this into deeper doo-doo, right? I mean, it's just another reason why amnesty is required. I mean, I've said this publicly, so I'll say it again here. I was personally threatened because I knew of a conversation that happened somewhere, and I alluded to it in the most elliptical fashion on a public broadcast. Literally a couple of days later, I get a phone call from a friend saying, XYZ at the White House is really pissed at you, and you should not ever say anything like that again because Title 18 applies. I said, what does that mean? Lethal force is operable. I'm not kidding you.
Oh my God.
I put down the phone and I honestly, I nearly broke down in tears. And I called a reporter friend of mine to just basically report it to them, to say, this just happened to me. I was just threatened because they knew what I was saying. Nobody else would have known what it was
Right.
what I was alluding to.
Regardless of whether or not it's aliens,
Yeah.
if they think you're disclosing their secure information, you might not
Well,
be
I wasn't
safe.
supposed to know it because I heard it from a friend who wasn't supposed to tell me in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah.
anyway.
Okay. Well, but okay. Returning though to the Tic Tacs, because I derailed you about Elizondo. What do you think, given this evidence that we have, are the competing hypotheses to account
Oh,
for it?
so one of the competing hypotheses is that it's that it was a blue on blue, it's called, counterintelligence program where what let's say the signal analysis people did was they inserted the information into the information systems of the radar to make it look like this happened, which is perfectly valid. Basically, it was basically can the idea being that if we could do it to us, then we can do it to the Russians, right? If we could reach into their systems and make them think that they're seeing things that aren't there,
Right.
and we can convince the most expert observers in the in our military that these things are there.
So it was a test in a sense.
Is a test. So and that so you could look at the men in black showing up on the ship and taking all the records as saying, well, we're going to remove the evidence so you won't figure out that we did this. So that's out there as an idea, and you have to keep it on the table. The only thing that counters that is that there were eyes on, right? So now you have to imagine that somebody had a holographic projector that made it look like there was something there. If we had holographic projectors like that, why are we going to the movies anymore? Working with 2D, so there's no holographic projectors that can reach across miles and make it look like something is there. So you can imagine that you could insert, false information into radar systems. But so that's a reasonable alternative.
So hypothesis one maybe is that it was an internal government military test that probably got out of hand. If it became New York Times front page news, that was probably not intended.
Right. Yeah, and so you have to then say, well, that the videos were that they had were faked, even though the guy was tracking it with the radar system, was able to get final lock on, and wasn't able to get lock on for a while. And if it were as some people claim, it was a seagull. This is Mick West, poor Mick. It was a seagull. Well, radars can track seagulls, right? Radars don't not lock on to conventional terrestrial objects. So whatever it was slippery from a radar locking standpoint. It wasn't moving at that time so fast that it could be called anomalous. I think they finally figured out it was maybe moving at about 180 miles an hour. But, it was certainly, it had no flight surfaces. It had no, this is the Tic-Tac, it had no heat signature. So what moves with no wings and no heat signature? What moves? Come on. What? Nothing. Maybe a balloon, right? But a balloon doesn't move in a straight line at 180 miles an hour. So what is it? So you're left with, and when there's eyes on, as well as the radar and the video of it, you kind of have to believe what the pilot said that they saw.
So if we then assume that the pilots did see what they saw, what they claim to have seen, what are your hypotheses for accounting for what they saw?
Well, the other alternative is that it is a U.S. program, that we do have motility approaches that have nothing to do with aliens or ETs or ultraterrestrials, that we have figured out how to move electromagnetically. And so I'm perfectly fine if that were the case. I'd be upset that, that I still have to get on a United airplane and deal with economy class, and I couldn't just be there, quickly. but again, I understand from a military standpoint, if such a thing were created that, or already available, that they'd want to keep it secret. But then you have to explain why this stuff was showing up in the 1950s and the 1960s, well before you could even imagine any kind of electromagnetic propulsion systems were understood, available, or implemented. When we were still busy figuring out how jet engines worked.
So to wrap up this discussion of the Tic-Tacs, what does all of the evidence and all of your thinking about the evidence lead you to conclude is really going on here?
That there's a technology that we don't understand. Simple. There's another one over Mosul, Iraq, of basically a 2-foot sphere moving. I mean, just pictures of it. And then the head of Arrow, Sean Kirkpatrick, who's reviled amongst the UAP community because he's so anti-UAP, even though he was supposedly the head of the group that has said that we don't know what this stuff is. Even he came out publicly and said, we have many videos and incidents of these metal spheres with no obvious propulsion moving across our military sites, as if they're, some sort of surveillance.
Well, the two main sorts of bodies of evidence we've discussed are these Tic-Tacs and then the anomalous health events that you were a part of, or health phenomena that you were a part of. And in both cases, what they lead you to conclude is that there exist advanced technologies that we just don't know how to account for. But that doesn't yet get us all the way to your conviction that aliens are or have been here. And
Yeah.
so,
And nor should it.
right. And I think that's good. That's healthy. What is it though? What is the smoking gun for you that tells you that even though you can't pull out the laser gun right now,
Right.
that you believe that aliens are or have been here?
I mean, for me, it's really the interpersonal interactions and my just summary of knowledge of the people that I work with, and the things that they say. I mean, that's it. That's the only thing that keeps me motivated at this point. I mean, my history of what happened to me as a boy is almost irrelevant, because maybe there's something unexplained that is explainable, that explains what it is that I saw.
That wasn't aliens?
That was an alien. I mean, it could be. I just don't know, right? So the only exit I have from the problem is, let's just go and see if we can get better pictures, more scientifically validated, and if we can call one of these things to show up.
That brings us to Skywatcher. And you mentioned it at the beginning of our conversation, but let's start from the beginning with that. What is Skywatcher and what prompted it?
So Skywatcher is a donor-funded group from a couple of high net worth individuals to collect information. And I'll talk about what has been public, because I'm not authorized to talk about what they're doing. So I'm part of the group, so I have to be careful that we've all agreed. But so what's public is what we did. So we had basically in the middle of open space, the numbers of cameras and sensors, as well as electronic calling capabilities, or electronic signaling capabilities, let's say it that way, with individuals who had been involved in a claimed crash retrieval, who had done retrievals for the US government, the 99% of which had nothing to do with UAP, just US Air Force or DOD objects, right, that they were then tasked, that crashed somewhere and they were tasked to go pick up. And so One of those individuals is Jake Barber, who is his story is already out there, and his record has been micro-examined by the skeptics, and they can find nothing wrong with his story and his credentials and who he is and what he's done. And so they have openly claimed that they were involved with these kinds of things, and they know how to do it. They know what kind of helicopters are required. They know the operation behind the scenes of how it is that an object is picked up and then transported secretly to another place, whether it's UAP or not. And when I was informed of this, and I sat there listening, I'm like, wow, that's impressive organization of what they need to do. I mean, it was like I couldn't even imagine. I would not have imagined that. So, the story behind the operations of what the U.S. government does to collect its own, instrumentation and materials and things is impressive enough. And so, but because of that experience, they were exactly the right people to get together to see if we could operationalize this for data collection or materials collection. There's no intent, by the way, to shoot anything out of the sky, because there's a bit of a story out there that this is what has gone on in the past, that we shoot them out of the sky, and that actually supposedly is true. But we have no intent to do anything like that. And I told them when they asked me to get involved was that if you're going to shoot anything down, I want nothing to do with it, because just from an ethics point of view, sort of a kind of a fun thing, but well, not fun, but if you shoot down something and there's somebody in it, there's a something in it, and it's intelligent, well, by human law, I'm not subject to anybody's crimes. I didn't kill a human. We only care about whether we killed human. But from an ethics standpoint, it's just as bad. So I told him, I said, I'm nothing to do with anything like that.
Also, if you just want to grant the assumption that there is some sort of alien in a craft like this, shooting at it seems like an absolutely terrible idea.
It sounds like, yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, the people who I know who even paint, as they say, they paint the objects with a radar reflection, they get basically back a wash of anti-signal that either shuts down their own stuff or basically makes their stuff go haywire. And I know to the audience in that sounds crazy, but I don't care. I'm just repeating the stories that are there. And again, it's part of the data. And if it's true, can you figure out a universe or a technology that's capable of such feats?
And we spoke quite briefly before this about some of the things that Skywatcher may be doing, but that you can't talk about on the air. But is there anything you can say about contact that has been made?
The intent is to attempt a form of contact.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean that's an open comment, and whether it happens or not, I mean that's the experiment. And a significant amount of resources is being put towards it, and it's being done in coordination, and we intend to coordinate this with the government. We were actually out, all the drone stuff that was going on in New Jersey last fall.
Well, let's assume that I don't.
Okay,
could you share
so
it
there were drones seen all up and down the eastern seaboard, and people had pictures of them and claimed drone incursions over airports and over military establishments, and it was all over the news, and if people want to do it, they can just go look it up. We saw that as an opportunity to test our capabilities, and so we were out there collecting information. And to be honest, the majority of the things that we saw were conventional drones of some sort. There were a few things that were unexplained and moved in anomalous ways, but the majority of the stuff seemed to be somebody's drones.
Do you think that means that some people might have just heard the news and then sent up their own drones?
Now, these were when you have drones coming in from the ocean and then returning to the ocean and are trailing Coast Guard boats for miles. That's not, hobbyist drones.
Mhm. And again, my guess is that this is an instance where the evidence leads you to the conclusion that there are advanced technologies that we cannot account for, but you can't rule out there being either, Chinese or Russian or something to that effect instead of there being
Yeah, I
aliens.
mean the drone stuff on the East Coast, I really don't know what it is, but they still don't have a full explanation for it. In fact, there was an interview on 60 Minutes just the other night by the head of like one of the FAA or something. He said we don't know what it was. But that doesn't mean that it was aliens. Uh, but but we tested our capabilities there. It was one of the first outings that we did.
Well, it is really distressing how much stuff is out there that is labeled anomalous by these heads of very important organizations
Yeah.
for transportation and national security.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, it tells you how limited our sensor systems really are, which actually tells you how open we are to attack from, bad actors, state actors. I mean, it tells you that, China or Russia could show up offshore with an apparent tanker, but it's full of drones and could completely, send the coastline into a frenzy. Because I think everybody has probably seen these drone light shows of what they can do with, hundreds of drones. So imagine if each of them were strapped with a bomb.
Without any further ado, I would like to turn to the Soul Foundation. It's come up a few times in this conversation, but before we talk about all of the many things that it is doing, just what is the Soul Foundation and why did you help start it?
So it's a think tank that I started with Peter Skafish, who's a philosopher and anthropologist, and David Grush, who we all know testified in front of Congress about the reverse engineering programs that he had discovered about. And the idea actually sort of germinated with my frustration dealing with the public, mostly, frankly, originally through Twitter, where I sort of became a celebrity making commentary on this stuff, and seeing how the public were talking about the issue, the matter, and realizing that there was a level of professionalism that needed to be brought to the table if we were ever going to make any positive movement. The arguments on Twitter, like on Facebook, the, comment, I mean, it was just ridiculous. And then you had the pseudo skeptics and the skeptics and all these people, and it was just a tangled mess. And I remember tweeting once saying that, if you guys don't get your act together, you're never going to progress this anywhere. This needs to be professionalized. And that kind of lit a light bulb in my head. And a friend who shall go unnamed, but he said, why don't you start an institute, a 501c3, to create an atmosphere and a room, essentially, within which other scientists can come and talk about this credibly. And so, it's really about creating a fence line and a landscape where scientists can come and do exactly what it is that I've been telling you I do on my day job of, hypotheses, ideas. You won't be laughed out of the room. Let's hear it. And in so doing, what happened was suddenly people came out of the woodwork who have always had an interest, but have felt like there was no place where they could do it that didn't involve tinfoil hats and crazy stories, or people who are, let's say, on the edge, and scientists, doctors, lawyers, military, government people, all over the place. And we had our first symposia actually here at Stanford, here in the engineering quad. And we had about probably 200 people there for that. And just, it was remarkable. And it was a series of talks about credible issues. Like, what does it mean for, for satellite deployment? That there might be things that are moving around that might get in their way. What does it mean for aviation security? What does data analysis mean in this area? Kevin Newth talked about, well, what does it mean if these things are moving at these speeds? What kind of energies are required? What do they have to, why is there no sound barrier issues with these things? Why do you not hear sonic booms? What would have to be to explain the lack of a sonic boom? And it's when you have a bunch of engineers with these kinds of problems, or scientists, or it becomes a fascinating issue. I mean, one of the things that I raised was patents. Patents, what does that have to do with anything? Patents are about protecting ideas. And so one of the tenets of a patent is you can't patent something if it's already been invented. Well, if you are reverse engineering alien technology, can you patent it? By one view of the rules, you cannot, because somebody invented it. Yeah, but they're not human. So if they're not human, can you patent some, so all of these kinds of legal issues, this is where the lawyers, and when I kind of tweeted that out at one point, it became like one of the most celebrated threads I ever created, because suddenly lawyers came in, had nothing to do with UAP, who just found the thought problem fascinating. Okay, well, no, maybe you could do this, or this is how you could do that. They were finding loopholes in the rules. And so that was the impetus. And so luckily there are any of a number of high net worth donors who were willing to step forward. We've created forums now. We have some online forums, et cetera. And it's all just about legitimizing the discussion. It's not about proving anything. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, there are people within the organizations and the sub-organizations and the umbrella that we've created who are manifestly more sure about any of this than I am, and go further than I would ever say. But I'm there just to say, look, if you want to convince a scientist, and science is one of the legs on which we need to stand for this, it's science, government, and the people. The people look to both. Government looks to the science. Science needs to be believed by the lay people. So we need to follow the rules. And the rules mean you don't talk about data until you've had it reviewed. You don't publish anything with a news report. You publish it in a peer-reviewed paper after careful analysis. So just creating and restating what to me is the obvious is the objective of this. Now the organization is much larger than it was before. Has a funding base. We have programs that we're doing. We get invited to, people say, oh, it's ruined your career. Well, it might have ruined my career, but I've had a lot more fun than I ever would have had being just a regular everyday scientist. Mm-hmm. Who gets to go, South by Southwest? I got to go brief the Canadian Parliament on this, on the UAP, right? I met with the heads of each of the parties, except the separatists. They weren't interested. I get invited to, fun, fancy parties to tell people the stories. And again, it's partly as a fundraiser, but also to engage the public in a way that it was not being served.
Mm-hmm. Now, most people, or maybe I'm just speaking for myself here, they associate think tanks with politics and government. Mm-hmm. And when I first looked at the Soul Foundation, I was surprised to see just how much of your efforts are going toward interface with the government. Mm-hmm. And so let me just ask, what are the white papers that the Soul Foundation is currently producing?
Well, we put out a white paper on, for instance, the United Kingdom and its involvement. And actually somebody from, I think it was the Bank of England, she wrote it. We've put out a white paper on USOs written by Lieutenant Gallaudet, who's the head of basically the NOAA, the weather agency. He was the lead weather, and he has said he's seen evidence of USOs. So he wrote something on that. We've had one on satellites. We've had one on religion. The other peg of all of this is religion. So we had a Catholic theologian write about, aliens. And it's very easy for religions to talk about aliens because they have angels and demons, right? So those are non-human intelligence. So the Catholic Church has a long history in this matter, being asked many times to comment on aliens and are aliens children of God? Why not? It actually makes God greater, in my view, to have kingdom over many intelligences. So those are the kinds of papers, and the reason why you put these papers out, it's as you know, when you write a paper that's published in a journal, you reference it, and the reference is saying, I don't need to prove this, or if you want to know more about this, go to here, because here I've already done it. You build it on a foundation. So I worked as a postdoc with this guy by the name of David Baltimore at MIT, a Nobel Prize winner for retroviral reverse transcriptase. And obviously a brilliant man. And I remember having a conversation with him about how I kept on hearing the word correlation in our group meetings, and this correlates with that. And I was like, why is the word correlation being used so much? And I remember him just sort of looking at me, and I realized sort of like the gulf between him and I in terms of, what and he said, it's like this, Garry. An idea by itself with no connection to anything else is a phenomena. Interesting choice of word, is a phenomena. But if you can link it to prior knowledge, you now stand on the hill of history. That's right? Interesting, yeah. So you've connected it to all prior human knowledge by finding at least a correlation, if not a causality. And so that's where UAP still is. It's still mostly a phenomena for most people. Now, maybe some people know more about it, and that it is no longer just a phenomena, but it is something that has a correlation or a causality associated with it. So that's really what I'm trying to do, is take those learnings from my mentors of how it is that you do good science. You do it openly, you do it properly, you share, you submit to the process of getting information out properly. And by transmitting that to others and holding that line, you create an ethic through which I think the field itself can go forward, or prove inevitably that it's all wrong. I would, frankly, and I said this before, I would love it if it were proven indubitably that it was all a fantasy and it was wrong. I can go back to my day job, fully committed and not distracted.
I'd like to ask about some specific items in the white papers and the research agenda, just because many things came up in my investigation of the Soul Foundation that I'd never considered before. One was...
And that's the point,
yeah,
is to make it obvious to people who have some sense of wonder that, hey, there's something more beyond this. It's not just, Spielberg's Aliens or E.T.
Yeah, here is just one. I mean, there are a number connected to the military, but here is one. I think there was a white paper about why the investigation into UAPs is so important and implementing policies surrounding them within governments is so important for preventing potential nuclear war. Why is that?
Because if an object were, and this was actually, there was an event like this, if an object, or let's say a fleet of objects, is moving towards the United States that would otherwise be interpreted as ballistic missiles that could that might trigger a response, you want to know, obviously, right? And so, you don't, I had a conversation with a government group just in the last month around just the thought of, if you were a, if you were Russia or if you were China and you wanted to use the stigma of UFOs to get a craft into the United States, or a bomb or a surveillance object into the United States, you'd make it look like, you'd basically cover it with something that made it look like a UFO, a flying saucer. And it was still conventionally driven by propellers for all you care, but you'd make it look like that because everybody would ignore it. They're like, oh, I don't want to see that, right? So, it's, and in fact, you've probably heard about the Chinese balloons, right? They were basically using our lack of attention to detail. And it was, and this is interesting, your audience probably doesn't know about it. It was only because we had been banging on NORAD and the others to open up the aperture of their detection systems that those balloons were found.
By we, you mean?
By we, meaning the UAP community, basically.
Oh, really?
Me and all that. Yeah.
That's fascinating.
So here's what happens. This is fascinating. Our sensor systems are so sophisticated that they collect so much information that you have to filter it out.
Right.
So what they do is the filters only look for things that we know about. And everything else that moves anomalously is filtered out because that couldn't possibly be a missile. So all the information that actually is UAP is just discarded. Literally, it's not even collected because they just are interested because they're scanning the skies and they can only look and spend so much time looking for the things that they know. What that does, though, obviously, is the unintended consequence of that is if somebody comes up with something even relatively conventional but falls outside of our parameters of what it is that the data we're collecting, they could slip in anything through the screen.
That's frightening.
Yeah.
Well, while we're on the topic of the military, I don't know if I should give his name the French pronunciation or the American pronunciation, but Rear Admiral Tim Gallaudet.
That's who I was talking about before,
Gallaudet. He penned a white paper, an interesting one, about transmedium crafts.
Right.
And so, one, what are transmedium crafts? And why should we be very interested in them? He says undue attention has been paid to these sorts of craft. We've been looking toward the sky.
Right. So one of the features of, so there are several features of what we consider to be UAP, and one of them is no flight surfaces, unconventional movement, transmedium travel. So meaning something that can go from water to air to space. We have nothing like that. We have stuff that can go from space to air, but not back again immediately, right? So something that can, at will, bounce amongst the three zones that we conventionally actually assign military value to. So space, we now have a space command, right? We have a space guard. I think that's what they're called, guardians. We have an Air Force. We have a Navy, right? So those three zones, and we have an Army, so things that, on land. But these objects seem to just move willy-nilly between all three of them. We have nothing like that. The last time I saw anything that moved from water to air and back was an old TV show called Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea. And they had this giant submarine, and they had something that basically looked like a UFO that came out and went back and forth. I mean, it's all fantasy, all science fiction. So we don't have anything like that. So again, how do you, and some of these USOs are claimed to move underwater at several hundred miles an hour. We have nothing like that. Nothing like that. That doesn't produce cavitation. Cavitation is, right? So no sound, but you can see it with sonar. So what kind of propellant works under the water and equally well in the air? What kind of motility or mobility force allows you to do that? Well, the one thing it does is this so-called warp bubble that allows you to basically ignore material, water, which kind of makes you think maybe this stuff could even go through mountains.
Well, one last aspect of the research agenda that I think you're probably best suited to speak about involves health and UAPs. And it is, no matter what you think about COVID, I think pretty much everybody thinks that the government did not respond very well to it. And the question then is, how ought we to deal with the possibility of UAPs that could have adverse health consequences and impacts for people in the
Yeah,
world?
I'm not so worried about it. And apart from like I said, getting behind their propulsion system or getting too close to them while they're moving, I'm not worried about them from either a biological threat.
So you're not worried about pathogens or anything
No,
like that?
no. I mean, look, whatever it is has been here long enough to, if there's anything here, alleged, to, it has no cross-species capability, right? I mean, it's the rare event that a bat virus, like some of the Ebola seems to be, this reservoir seems to be in bats. My lab studied Ebola for a while, or monkey transmission, or now avian flu, right? Transmits across species. It's very rare. So something from another planet, who even knows if it's, uses the same DNA bases that we do? Its metabolism would be so different. I mean, sure, could it be? Yeah. Am I worried? No. Can I do anything about it? No. So I'm even less worried.
Avi Loeb has come up in this conversation, I think once or twice. He was a guest on the show a year or two ago. But for our listeners who don't know who he is Avi, and how would you summarize his impacts on the field? Because he's an important member on. He's an advisor. He's on the board at Seoul.
He's an advisor on one of the advisory boards. Yeah. So Avi Loeb was the chairman of the Department of Astronomy at Harvard. He's not the chairman anymore, but he's still in the department. And he was, I think, is best known, at least publicly, for his observation of the Uma event, which was an interstellar meteor rock that seemed to come through on a trajectory from another solar system. And as it exited our solar system, it was moving pretty fast, obviously. It was seen to move, I mean, through, a telescope. It seemed to speed up. And what speeds up on its way out of a solar system? It was clearly one of the first, it was, I think, the first interstellar meteor ever seen. And so one of the hypotheses that Avi and his postdoc put on the table was that maybe it was an interstellar probe from another civilization that was making a flyby, and as it left our solar system, it sped up and went off in another direction to the next solar system. It was just an idea. He got absolutely savaged by the astronomy community. How dare you say anything like that? And if you know Avi, he's an intellectually pretty astute and complete guy.
He's very sharp.
Very sharp. And he was, in the same way, and this is sort of, I think we had a kindred spirit. He and I were, I mean, he just had this righteous indignation that how dare you say that I can't talk about this. In fact, before he knew me, I sent him an email when all this controversy, and the email was just, welcome to the club.
Very good.
I don't know if he ever, he never wrote back at the time. And because I think he was too busy like protecting himself from his otherwise, colleagues. But, he took the same approach that I did. He said, okay, well, if the stuff is here, we have the following kinds of things that we can do to collect data on them. Here's the telescopes we can make, here's the radars we can make. So he raised money. He built an observatory on the top of the Harvard Astronomy building, which I've been to. And then he's raised money for putting other ones around the United States to just collect the data. And that's it. But he has an amazing, what I don't have, he has an amazing administrative capability where he can he's energized a group of probably about 100 or 150 scientists, volunteers, to write computer programs, build the instruments, design the instruments, all of this, all for free, all basically on a shoestring. But
this is the Galileo project?
The Galileo project, yeah. I'm part of the Galileo project. I haven't been on enough of the of their weekly meetings because I've had too many other things going on. But Avi doesn't need me. When the aliens land or material shows up. But then, he got interested in another thing that appeared to be an interstellar object that actually came into Earth's atmosphere and exploded down in the South Pacific. Probably know about this, where he went and collected, nodules from the bottom of the ocean and developed a whole program around that and showed, beyond a shadow of a doubt that it wasn't what some scientists said it was volcanic ash or something like that. He showed that, look, for all intents and purposes, this came from a meteor. It doesn't mean that it was a alien meteor, but it had all the characteristics that you would expect of an interstellar meteor. And I think he's planning on going next summer to look for bigger chunks of it rather than just the little nodules. So, he's putting his money where his mouth is. He's already been chairman of astronomy, and he's a dark matter specialist. He's reached the top of his career. He writes papers like there's nobody. I mean, I'm kind of envious of the physicists, mathematicians. They can write a paper and a proof and get it published in a week. I have to do 3 years of research and then go through 6 months of review with a paper before it can get out. I mean, I still have 400 papers, but I think Avi's up around 900 or so. So, he's just a machine, and I love him for it. And so he's kind of like, Harvard and Stanford, the two bookends of, the only other one I'd love to get somebody at MIT. Those are the technological universities that stand atop the heap. And so if you've got people like that saying there's something worth looking at, maybe you should at least listen for more than a minute.
The other person very involved in the Soul Foundation that I wanted to ask about, because he's another huge name in this field and he's come up on the show, is Jacques Vallee. And just again, summary for our listeners who aren't familiar with him, who is he and what role has he played in this community over the last many years?
Well, first, he's my principal mentor in all of this, in teaching me how to think about it and giving me a framework and sort of rescuing me from the wiles of the internet and all of the stories of, that people think and saying, no, here's this, no, you can't think, no, here. So he's been my mentor for easily the last 12 years. I mean, I'm in awe of the man. He's 85 or 86 and he's still running around like a maniac. But he was the first person to come up with the interdimensional hypothesis, saying that you need to think beyond the concept of alien and limitations of what alien means to explain this. And he became actually a heretic amongst he also went through a phase where the UFO community was like, oh, no, he's absolutely wrong. These are aliens from another planet. He's like, no, maybe they're from this. And again, it was just like, I'm just saying maybe, I'm not saying it is. But he, as a young boy, saw a UFO with his mother in France, where he grew up. And it was corroborated by another individual. So he has that kind of, that firmament on which he stands of a memory of something that fuels a decisiveness about it. And so then he was an astronomer and in Paris. And one of the things that he said he remembers seeing was an object that they were tracking that was not doing the correct orbit around the planet. And then how that data was ignored and then later wiped. So that kind of triggered him. He came to Stanford, actually, to work here in the early days of artificial intelligence, and then developing ARPANET, which was the precursor to the internet. So he was involved in that. So he's like one of the pioneers of what became the internet. But then he wrote a series of books. He just got involved in it, but brought a kind of academic rigor to it and an open-mindedness to it. He, visited the Soviet Union around UAP, et cetera, and then became a name. He went to Colares and, documented all of the stuff that was going on there down in Brazil that I told you about earlier. And he, his involvement is always welcome because he brings such a fresh perspective to the whole thing, and is, if anything, he's the devil's advocate to any idea you might have. The moment you become, for instance, at one point, I was personally convinced that whatever these things were likely time-traveling future humans. It was the only explanation in my head. And then he just disabused me of my, by just kicking the foundations from underneath my argument. And I loved that. I love people who can prove my absolute conclusion wrong.
Yeah, I love that too.
It's like, just tell me, yeah, okay, great. Ooh, that's wonderful. Okay.
Because that means you've advanced.
Yeah.
If something you really believed is proven wrong, then you've learned something really important. Some people hate that, but.
And he wrote a series of books called Forbidden Science. He's up to like volume 6, I think. And, somebody told me, oh, you need to read Jacques' diaries. They're his diaries from the beginning of when he got involved with this. And like literally nearly every other day. Maybe each day might only be a page or even half a page or even just a paragraph. But documenting all the players. I never thought anybody's diary could be anything other than boring. Riveting from beginning to end. And he's finally on, I think, volume 6. And I finally show up in like volume 6. It's been interesting kind of reading, the conversations that I had with him back then. But I wish I had, again, that kind of discipline to have done something like that over the years. It's like people who take pictures of themselves from when they were like 7 years old until today, and the changes over time. And so he, it's the written history of the field for the last 50 years, 60 years. And so, how can you not honor someone like that? And I think he's more or less universally adored.
So something I get a lot of negative feedback for doing on the show is interviewing people on both sides of an issue, which I think is extremely important to do. So I will interview somebody who is very pro-Trump, interview somebody who's very anti-Trump, interview somebody who is very pro the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, interview somebody, I think I said pro, interview somebody who's anti. And I imagine that virtually all of my guests are quite anti-aliens because they're in academia. And I know that I'm going to get a lot of flack for interviewing you, but I think that, as I said earlier, this is one of the most important questions, and it's really important to have it on a show like this. Now, that being said, and this is where I want to make sure that I'm being entirely respectful, I agree with you, or I take all of this data very seriously. What I read in the books on UFOs and government, it was extremely compelling. It was extremely surprising. And yet, I remain a skeptic and want to search for a more mundane explanation of these phenomena while still maintaining a sense that these other options are possibilities. So just to put it very bluntly, I do not believe that aliens have visited the planet. And what do you tell to somebody who says this to you?
I just listen to them. It's just data. I mean, it's, you know, it was literally Jacques who taught me it's the data, not the conclusion, because conclusions can be so easily disproven. I could tell you that it's reptilians from the Pleiades here to, take our people. Easily disproven. So just get somebody else to listen to and believe the data. So you've read those reports from the military book history that you wrote. I imagine that you believe the data. Mm-hmm. You know, you don't necessarily believe a conclusion. I always look at something and go, did they collect the data right? Is there something? So I am as much a skeptic. You don't need to interview a skeptic because I'm the skeptic, right? And if I wear my scientist's hat correctly, I am both pro something and the anti-pro of that conclusion, because you have to be that. Because as I said earlier, the scientist is meant to be wrong today because they're going to be righter tomorrow. And that's the approach that I take. I can go to my grave not having proven anything about this, but it's the ride, and I've had a lot of fun along the way, and I've exercised my mind I've done the biology. I don't want to do another biology. I don't want to be a person carried out in a casket from my office, and the nuance of some protein. That's not exciting to me anymore. I've done it. I want to do something exciting.
It's a good note to end on, Gary. This has been an excellent and supremely fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for having it with me.
Thank you, and I hope your listeners believe the data. Mm-hmm.